that globalism, of course, that has changed our markets and life, goods, services, and however, there have been new.
Okay. Oh, I gotta. Shit. This gets changed to this. Why my mouse? Okay.
Threats and challenges such as terrorism, global pandemic disease, and devastating economic shifts as manufacturing of essential goods has moved overseas. This was a particular note during the coronavirus, where it was impossible to shut down travel without devastating economic effects, and countries prioritized themselves when it came to manufacturing medical goods. What is the future order, globalism or nationalism? Do nationalists have a right to determine their country's fate? Are we already too intertwined? How do we face down rivals who make essential goods for us?
I'm Beckett of Crabs. You can find me at Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, obviously all places. I generally do old internet law, theology, bit of counterterrorism stuff, general whatever's going on. Globalism's an interesting one. It's not a modern creation. We've had trade routes and the issues with them since the effects of the fall of Mesopotamia. Like when we talk about the idea of this sort of new global world, it's not really new. It's just an idea that resurges. I think the core issue is just being pragmatic about things. Sometimes we have issues where we need to keep infrastructure in place. For instance, keeping slaughterhouses open, even if like we've got the capacity to produce food in other places, so we don't undergo systemic collapses. Ultimately, people have the right to self-determination, but if you exist as an island, you are going to fail because the world is going to move on without you.
All right, thank you for that. Mr. Destiny, would you care to introduce yourself to the folks at home and then also give us your thoughts on the first topic?
Hey, I'm Destiny. You can find me at youtube.com/Destiny. I'm an institutional shill, a proud Democrat, and a strong supporter of a God Emperor President Biden. I think echoing the thoughts of the last guy, Beckett, globalism is kind of an inevitable way forward. I mean, we're more interconnected today than we ever have been before. Old technologies like trade routes, new technologies like the internet are only going to further this level of global integration. People that are looking at a more nationalistic country are yearning for the days of old that will never come back. To go forward into nationalism is to step backwards in terms of our place in the world. And I think as long as we want to remain with our position in the world, being economic leaders, military leaders, and influential leaders, I think it's probably best that we continue down the globalistic path that we are on now.
All right, appreciate you. Thank you kindly, sir. Mr. Dillon, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Do you need a minute to get oriented? I wanted to let the globes go first and then let the...
Yeah, I'd like a minute to get oriented if possible.
No problem. Then Mr. Rob, can you introduce yourself to the folks at home, and can you give us your thoughts on the first topic?
Hi, folks at home. I'm Rob. I consider myself a populist conservative. I would consider myself a nationalist. I enjoy streaming on Twitch, YouTube, Rumble, and other places. I have a panel show on Saturday.
Can it just not grab it? What's happening here?
Crucible Network. Yeah, I think when it comes to this topic, there's going to be a fundamental misunderstanding on what we're talking about when we talk about nationalism and globalism. And I think this misunderstanding is used by people that
just
really
needs to be
advocate
more
for
than
what I consider
not
insidious
just like two.
globalism in order to enforce that. And what that is the idea that an integrated world means a globalist world. It does not. I am all for an integrated world. I think technologies that allow us to communicate with people around the world at a speedy pace, have employment situations where people from all over the world can live, cultural values that can be shared.
Just
around
quiet.
the world, all good stuff. That's all good. To me, the concepts of nationalism and globalism have to do with our systems of governance. And to make it as simple as possible, it would be this. A nationalist government is a government that cares first and foremost and advocates for the people and governs for the people that are citizens of its country. A globalist government is one that cares less about the citizens of its country and their sovereignty and wants to govern as a world order. And to me, that is what is insidious and nefarious about globalism, is that it seeks to erode national sovereignty and national boundaries. We can see that systems of governments, even any national level, the further they get away from individuals, the less they are inclined to understand the way that those individuals live. So your local government probably understands your way of life more than your state government, which probably understands it more than your national government. Now take that out to a globalist society, and all of a sudden we have people in Davos that are telling people in Ethiopia how they could live and what's ethical for them to consume and how they could have farming practices. We saw this with Brexit and with things that there were people fishing lanes and things like that around the UK that were being eliminated. And it's also bad because it's ran by a bunch of people that are incredibly wealthy and corrupt that seek to use this to consolidate power for themselves and return us to a form of feudalism.
Beautiful. Appreciate you, buddy. Mr. Nevin, can you introduce yourself and also give a kickoff for the first topic?
Alrighty, I'm Nevin Gusak. I'm the host of the Populist Patriot YouTube channel. I'm also on Twitter. This is my first debate panel, and I'm honored to be here. And hello, everyone. I call myself a radical civic nationalist. If it's cool, I'd like to read a quote by former President Franklin Roosevelt that really crystallizes or summarizes, I should say, my political viewpoint. And I used to be a Reagan conservative, but I abandoned that for a number of different reasons. Where he said in his speech, in our personal ambitions, we are individualists, but in our seeking for economic and political progress as a nation, we all go up or else all go down as one people. So my type of nationalism really eschews the extremes of laissez-faire capitalism, as well as the extreme forms of totalitarian collectivism, of fascism and communism. I'm for a form of pre-Reagan capitalism where you have strong unions, you have certain social democratic programs that allow people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps to achieve social mobility. My ideological point of view or brand of nationalism is kind of a big tent for people of different genders, sexual orientations, races, classes, etc., as long as you're committed, at least in some form or another, to the national interest. Globalism, there's always going to be a form of global interconnectedness with technology, as was previously pointed out. Historically, we have always been interconnected for hundreds of years. I don't think there's any dispute. But when it impairs our productive capacity or core productive capacity, as well as our national security, that's where I kind of draw the line and express very strong concerns. Because on the flip side, in history, we have seen, for example, how British trade, and especially French trade with National Socialist Germany during the 1930s did not result necessarily in peaceful relations. In fact, in this case, and I can cite sources, so if you challenge me on my facts, give me some time and I can cite some sources, look it up and whatnot. France exported wood, iron, and all kinds of other materials to Germany, and look what happened in 1940. You look what happened
Nevin,
during the
I want to leave some stuff for the center part of the debate. So can you
Sure.
just bring it to a close for your opening?
Sure. Yeah. So there has to be a balance ultimately. We have to balance the needs of, yes, an interconnected world to some point without harming excessively our national sovereignty and national security.
Based. Thank you. Mr. Dillon, are you ready to introduce yourself to the folks at home?
Sure. My name is Dylan Burns. I am, I guess, an amateur war journalist and Twitch streamer, and I'm a globalist lib-cuck. That's the best way to describe me. I'm a libtard.
All right, beautiful. Well, and did you want to do any other intros besides that?
Sure. I mean, first question was, could you just give me a quick refresher, basic?
Absolutely. So basically, I was saying that there are a lot of advantages to globalism, like increased trade and global security, less war, all that kind of stuff that we've seen statistically since World War II. But we've also had new emerging threats like terrorism, pandemic disease, and also our rivals manufacturing.
Is there a reason you're
essential
not grabbing
goods.
that?
This was a particular note during the COVID pandemic where we were reliant on China for essential medical goods, and they were basically our rival and prioritized themselves over us. So I was asking what the future of the global order is going to be. Is it going to be globalism? Is it going to be globo homo? Nothing negative against globo homo. I'm trying to be descriptive here, where it's progressive, internationalist, lots of countries cooperating, all of that kind of stuff. Or is it going to be more nationalist, where basically you have these countries that are pulling back from the global order and trying to manage their own affairs? What are the balance between the two, and who should win this battle?
I mean, I guess for me personally, I think globalism is like fighting the waves of the ocean, and you're trying to build a sandcastle. It's like fighting a like an overarching powerful force, almost like a force of nature, much less an ideological structure. Just the economic motivators in place have push human beings not only to become more interconnected, but to also build institutions that manage international trade, like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and other organizations to unite nation states. And even nation states that are known as like these anti-globalist crusaders like Hungary will get on their knees and beg for the European Union's aid and supply to help their country stay on its feet as it goes through economic problems. And many nations throughout Eastern Europe beg to be part of these globalist institutions like the European Union, which have been really vital in bringing Europe to one of the most prosperous eras in its history when it comes to a lack of conflict, only to be interrupted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine that many could maybe even say is a reaction to the success of the globalist project of the European Union, of the expansion of NATO, of all of these things. When we talk about globalism, I think globalism can be both good and bad. Like, for example, I think the interconnectedness of the international human trafficking and stuff like that, it's obviously bad. But these things are not going to be solved by isolationist solutions. We've seen how drug cartels have used things like submarines and drones in order to get around these types of things. And that's true of all of these international crime organizations, terror groups, etc. And I think the thing that's really going to combat them is by empowering the international institutions that are going to help us create and draw pathways in a new globalized world. People like to shit on the UN all the time for the failures of its international peacekeeping missions, but a lot of people don't realize just how cost effective the UN is. For example, people talk about how much money America wastes on foreign aid. In 2021, I think we spent $1.5 billion in aid to the United Nations and UN peacekeeping missions. I think it was specifically UN peacekeeping missions. Of the 16 peacekeeping missions that the UN has been involved in, I think in the last 20 years, you know, in conflicts in Mali, Croatia, etc., 11 of them have been conducted successfully. As for all the failures of Srebrenica, usually when the UN fails, it's because it doesn't have enough authority to act, not because it had too much authority and went too far. And I really do think that it gets kind of an unfair shake. It has problems, but all institutions have problems. And I believe in institutions, and I think we need to strengthen these institutions to guide us in a more globalized world, which is inevitable as human beings become more interconnected. And hopefully this interconnectedness brings us to a new era of prosperity and peace, as many international liberal theorists have theorized. Now I need to go to the bathroom.
Perfect timing. All right, then the panel is open. You guys are free to fight amongst yourselves. If I feel like we're getting into too big of tangents, or if we're going on down too far of a rabbit hole, I'm going to drag you back in. I will give you timers, be watching my hands. But besides that, have at it, gentlemen.
Okay. Let me just ask that straight up, if no one's going to say anything. When we're talking, so Destiny, Dylan, and maybe Beckett as well, when we're talking about the inevitable nature of globalism, are you talking about the inevitable nature of interconnectedness, so like economically, or the inevitable nature of eventually having a global form of government?
Because I wanted to respond to something Patriot said about sort of the interconnectivity of capitalism. There's like a long-running theory that we can see
Maybe
in the
I
Golden
can
Arches
use
theory.
this
For
to make
anyone who
my
doesn't know, it's the idea
engines.
that if two nations both
How
have
many
McDonald's,
engines are being used to
they
make
don't go to war with each other. Now that fell apart
two?
over a decade ago, and in the case of like Russia and Ukraine, we can see it falling apart, right? So I think there's like it's a complicated issue when we're looking at the economics, because it's not clear cut, and just because we kind of go, well, we'll trade with another country and then it will make us friends with them, doesn't mean it'll always work. Countries aren't just going to be like, well, they're trading with us, so we're going to be nice. So to the point about Germany and France, I don't think that's an argument against globalism. It's just an argument against kind of naively trying to bring your allies on board. But I think generally it's just the inevitable march. We expand, we get more connected. It doesn't necessarily need to have one government, but it needs to have kind of clear goals.
I know
right?
that this was lacking
This is
before,
one of the
when this
problems
was
we
running
see
at full
with the
pace.
EU.
I think the
It
engines were
lacks
lacking.
those clear goals.
I think it's just better I make a new...
I think if you don't mind me jumping in,
A
I
new
think there are
line.
just, it's like the term socialism and capitalism. It means 50 things for 50 people. And I think there are different types of globalism too as well. Probably the most powerful version of globalism that exists institutionally in the United States is
Maybe I
what
can
I
make
would
blue
term
ones from
corporate
these two, though?
globalism, because major multinational corporations in Wall Street have disproportionate political power. But then you also have
I think it's the same problem.
And you guys may disagree with me.
But that's
I
not
may be
true,
wrong
actually,
on
no.
this.
The
Communists
red-
claim
well,
you're internationalists.
Yeah,
for
the
global
red isn't the
order,
problem. It was the
if you
steel.
will. You even have some
steel
you know,
anyways.
Nazi elements there for, like the World Church of the Creator for this huge genocidal,
Engines
maniacal
will be
white
made by
world.
separate
It
thing.
just, crosses so many different spectrums, means so many different
Maybe I
things
can make
to
these
people.
blue guys here.
And I guess the question is what kind of globalism does each and every the globalist members of the panel support? Do you recognize the need for some level of productive capacity here in the United States? Do you
'Cause
feel
this
there
steel
should
isn't
be
getting used that
limits
much.
for national security? I used to be a
Maybe we can make more
pure free trade
sulfuric
person,
acid and sulfuric
libertarian
acid.
person, and I'm
I
not
think it's
against
just better to
trade
build
per
everything on here.
se.
Just go and expand it
But
with stuff.
what opened my eyes, and one of my areas of interest intellectually, is the history of communism, fascism, National Socialism, and their strategies against the West. And one of the things that opened my eyes was, for example, and I know, Dylan, you've been to Ukraine, so I'm sure you're probably familiar with this. Destiny, I know you're an expert on a lot of economic issues as well. But this was reported in the mainstream press, where when Ukrainian forces and their American backers cracked open Russian-made military weapons, they found all manner of components from American firms, British firms, Israeli firms, their allies in communist China, et cetera, et cetera. And I know the arguments, of goods trade across borders, armies won't. I know I'm mangling Frederick Bastier's quote, my apology. But when I look at the hard evidence, that kind of has pushed me away from that position. Now, does globalism have its positive benefits? Of course.
If I may jump in, but I think that's a good place. If I could summarize, in what you're saying, what it means to me is this: there are different meanings that people use by the term globalism, and that's sort of what I'm getting to. Because one of the strongest arguments I think the globalists on the panel are going to make is what's inevitable. So the debate becomes irrelevant and one of Connor's questions was, is it too late? Are we already too interconnected? So that's the question I have, which is, when you're saying that globalism is inevitable, do you mean sort of culture, communication, economic ties? Or are you talking about a system of governance where we have places like the UN, the World Health Organization, other places like that end up having more power governmentally and they can override nation states? That's the question I have for the globalists.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some level of global coordination with big, intra or international bodies. But I think that in a way is kind of necessary. I think that it's probably better to have those big international bodies because there's probably going to be in some ways, we're going to get there in less efficient ways individually without those international bodies. So for instance, we could have a global climate conference where we decide to set, goals for every country that's part of the EU or part of NATO or part of whatever international body we want to use. And we could set that, and people say, well, that's infringing on our sovereignty. We'd rather deal with it nation by nation. But if we deal with it nation by nation, you might end up getting countries that set certain standards where it's we're only going to trade with you if your climate or pollution controls are at such a level anyway. So in one way or another, you end up kind of getting to these international standards just set unilaterally or multilaterally regardless. So I feel like having these central bodies, or at the very least you have some level of representation, is probably good. It probably does more for your sovereignty to be part of these international governing bodies than to be independent of them. I think we kind of see that with Brexit when it comes to the United Kingdom, right? The whole idea was they are going to have more sovereignty with their country and their economy by leaving the European Union. But now the UK effectively has no say in European Union governing policies, but they're still going to be beholden to those policies if they want access to that trade union, basically.
Well, I think that Brexit's actually a good example because it shows the nefarious nature of global governance, where what you saw with Brexit, what was it, the Lisbon Treaty before that the UN put, and the UN makes
Holy
this
fuck, I'm gonna
argument that
sneeze.
there's
It's not gonna be
democracy
fun.
that gives people a voice, but they don't. What they do is they give you a voice and then they use propaganda to inundate people to think that they'll get the result they want. And when they don't, like with Brexit, what happens? Well, they just drag it out for years and years and say, who gives a shit what your opinion is, people? The vote was only purely symbolic. We really don't give a shit. And we can see that's what's been going on in the UK. We saw it's what happened in Ireland and other places. You could also see.
Wait, can you
how
explain
the
that?
UN
What does that mean? The vote was purely symbolic.
Because Brexit occurred, they said, the UK said, we will abide by what the people want, right? And then all of the institutional propaganda was, well, clearly we need to stay within the European Union. And everyone in the European Union
there is a
that's
lot
what-
more complex. Look, there's a lot more complexity to this. Now, I come at this from a weird position because I'm a Leave voter who's pro-immigration and open borders and very left-wing and very actually pro-federalized Europe. So like, Europe is. I was a Eurosceptic because of Corbyn when I was like 60, and there is so much more going on with Brexit and like what goes on in the UK.
Has it been achieved?
No, but that's not because of globalism. That's because of massive political incompetence. Like, even when we got close to the deal described within the original campaign brought back by Theresa May, everyone voted against it because everyone was politicking for the next general election. This idea that globalism or like particular powers undid Brexit, it's purely down to political
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that it was like cigar smoking people.
Let me finish, because like one of the biggest reasons for Brexit was so we could actually get a handle on the fact that our political class kept making like huge blunders or fucking things up, and then got to blame the EU for shit that wasn't their fault. When we look at Ireland, you brought up Ireland. Ireland doesn't enforce its tax codes to the same level as the rest of Europe. Europe went and investigated and said, you're going to do this. And Ireland said, what are you going to do about it? And you see this happen with multiple regulations. One of the biggest problems Britain had with the EU is we were one of the few countries really trying to apply regulations, whereas most countries just were much more pragmatic. And then you get into the whole veto movement and the block of veto countries that rallied behind Britain as that sort of central state. It's a much more complicated problem than just globalism.
You could say it's much more complicated, but just like with the Libsyn Treaty, what happened was the institutional people that had power in the UK assumed that wanted to remain with the European Union, assumed through all of the information they were putting out there that it would be a massive win to stay in the European Union. It wasn't, and because those people in positions of power wanted afterwards, they didn't like the result. That's why you heard so many people come out, people in positions of power in the media, etc., came out and said, no, we should revote. People didn't understand what they were getting. It's time for a revote. The point is, these global institutions give you the sort of symbolic vote, and if you vote in a way that they don't like, it seems to never get implemented. And then they'll revote like with the Lisbon Treaty, and then all of a sudden, it went their way. And that got enacted real fast. And the point I'm trying to make is these organizations, one, they're corrupt, and we could get into that if you want, but even if we don't get to that, when you have the systems of governance that are so far away from the actual people that they're governing, there's less ability for them to actually govern in a way that makes sense for those people. I don't want people in Brussels telling me how I could live.
Well, first of all, you have a say in that. This is what the whole point of electing a member to European Parliament is. Well, now you don't have a say in that. Or you don't anyway because you're American, sorry. But can we, backing up to the Brexit thing, I don't understand why we have to pretend like there was some nefarious power that was working behind the scenes in order to make it so that people had mixed opinions on Brexit once it was passed. Like, Brexit passed by the skin of its teeth. It's not like this was massively popular throughout the entire United Kingdom. In fact, there were some states of the United Kingdom that didn't want a Brexit at all, which is why you saw people memeing about Scotland leaving and stuff, right? I think that you can say that, like, Brexit passed barely. Nobody really knew, I think, what Brexit was going to look like. And then there was a lot of debate post-Brexit over, well, what the fuck does it actually mean to Brexit? I think that these are all...
A lot of it was kicking the Tories in the teeth. Huge amounts. Like, again, as a Eurosceptic, I can admit that. It wasn't about we hate Europe. It's David Cameron is an arse, and this is a chance to actually hit back from the Northern Bloc that's been ignored for the past, like, 60 years. It's much more complicated than, oh, well, actually, I think economically we'd be better off. There were blocs doing that, but they were a minority. Before Brexit happened, the Eurosceptics were a huge minority in the UK. It's only with the rise of UKIP that we really saw kind of like a call for the referendum, and Cameron wanted to do the same thing in with Brexit that he did with the Scottish referendum vote, because he thought it'd be an easy win.
Yeah, I'm just trying to say that, I think there was legitimate debate over that. I don't think it was spooky people using propaganda to confuse the population. I think Brexit was genuinely a very contentious and complicated issue in the United Kingdom and different parts of the United Kingdom.
Well, I mean, one of the go ahead.
I think one of the most obvious examples of how a lot of people didn't know how it was going to go was the Ireland border issue, where I don't think that was not talked about at all in the lead up to Brexit. It was all about, all the money they would save for the NHS and all about the immigration, and really none of it had to do with the Good Friday Agreement and exactly how complicated it would be making this deal with the European Union after the fact to guarantee that the Good Friday Agreement was abided by and that violence wouldn't flare up again in Northern Ireland. And that really extended how long Brexit negotiations went into it. And that soured Brexit in the minds of a lot of Northern Irish people who thought that Brexit was really throwing away the Good Friday Agreement and also backstabbing a lot of people like the DUP when it came to the idea that there will not be an infringement between the border of Northern Ireland and the UK, which one of the deals that they were negotiating with the EU at one point was literally putting up basically a border, a semi-border between the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. And these were the things that were not hammered out beforehand and not thought about. And that's why now the vast majority of British people, I think it's like over 54% compared to 34%, think now was the wrong decision to leave the European Union.
Right, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. The idea that people were saying, well, it wasn't something nefarious. Right, just like it wasn't nefarious that, like, at the same time Brexit was going on and we had this populism in the UK, you had a president in the United States that was being elected in Donald Trump. And it was just also coincidental that all of these major institutions all went in the same direction and hating that form of populism as well. And just like with Donald Trump, which we'll get into at a later date, I'd love to debate any of you on it, just like the institutions were corrupt in trying to impede his presidency, it just so happens that one of the most established first world countries in the world, the UK. When was Brexit voted on? 2015. So what are we on now? We're going to get to a decade before they get around to a company.
Hey, look, we've been going through a lot of prime ministers.
They can't figure that out. We should give them a say in like how we in the United States live. They're so fucking incompetent. They can't even come through with removing themselves from this treaty.
If we're gonna
I feel
make,
like you're not
if we're gonna make,
responding to my point at all.
wait, hold on. If we're gonna make claims, I think we should have real claims, right? Like saying that, like, was it a coincidence all this happening around? That's like saying, was it a coincidence that in 2013 and onwards, a whole bunch of right-wing movements started to gain more popularity in Europe, ignoring the fact that the Syrian refugee crisis was driving everybody in that direction? Like, yeah, of course there are political movements happening all over the world. We can't just point to them all and go, look at that spooky globalist, like, people behind the curtains. Like, if there's something you want to say in terms of some, like, coordination between the United States to discredit Trump and Brexit or something, then point that out. But we can't just go like, well, isn't that weird? And like, we're making an argument. That's not an argument. We're not like saying anything of value there. There's nothing that's being said.
Well, I could get through and I'll look for the numbers because I've seen this, right? But we saw that the media coverage from major institutions, including state institutions in the UK, places like their state media, were overwhelmingly for remaining in the EU. People in positions of power were overwhelmingly for remaining in the EU. Just like in the United States, there are tangible, it's tangential that we could see there was a movement against populism there. And it makes sense because institutions that currently have power aren't interested in nationalism or populism that devolves that power to the actual people.
Is it not possible that the majority of politicians thought it was better for the UK to stay in the EU? Considering the UK had like one of the most preferential like positions in the European Union, they weren't part of the Eurozone, they weren't part of the free trade Schengen area, they had a say in the European Commission. Like, is that not possible?
Well, it certainly is possible. So let's say that it was organic. Just like it's very possible that the people in the FBI, etc., and the media in the United States...
Whoa. What does the FBI have to do with the UK? One topic at a time.
Oh, okay. What I'm trying to say is, in both situations, it's possible that these were heartfelt beliefs from the people in those positions. So maybe 90% of politicians in the UK thought that Brexit was a mistake. That could be true. The point I'm trying to make is, those with institutional power didn't want this outcome, and once that outcome occurred, it seems that they did everything they could for 8 years on now to not follow through on the democratic process that they promised.
Well, you know, and this is my take on Brexit. I don't consider myself an expert necessarily, but it also papered over the long-term, it papered over a larger structural issue that was occurring for over 30 years of a long-term structural deindustrialization of Britain. And many of those people in those parliamentary districts that voted for Brexit, correct me if I'm wrong, were those people that were affected by that. And, you know, part of the issue, getting back to Connor's point, is globalization inevitable and this and that. I think it's, to some degree it is, but also I have concerns that, and I know I'm going to throw a bomb here that's going to stir up a hornet's nest, but there's a potentiality, you just don't know, war between the United States of the West and Russia and China. You know, from my standpoint, the Cold War never truly ended. It could develop, God forbid, and I hope to God I'm wrong, of a Cold War, and that could cause the collapse, at least temporary, of globalization. You know, to answer Connor's earlier point. But I think with Brexit, I think it papers over, in my opinion, a larger structural decline, financialization and deindustrialization of Britain. If you want a truly healthy nationalism in Britain, you have to reverse to some degree Thatcherism and New Labour as well.
I want to interject real quick. So I have no problems going into we're going to get it over to Dylan. He did raise his hand. I have no problems getting into the nitty-gritty of a specific subject, particularly if it's an example of the general question, but I also want to discuss this in the frame of the general question. Because what I've heard so far is Rob saying it was the will of the people, they wanted to leave, fuck it, this is nationalism and democracy, and we're pretending to have democracy. And then what I'm hearing from the Globes is, well, you're too integrated, and it's a very complex issue, and because you're too integrated, you can't have your national will. That's what I've heard so far. So you guys don't have to expand it. As long as I have engaged panelists, I don't really give a shit what you guys are talking about, but I do want to reel it in into the broader topic. Dylan, whatever you want to say, and then it's back open.
Well, I mean, like when we talk about like the narratives pushed by the elites here, what about the narrative about the money that would be saved by the NHS and the buses that were driven around the UK? That was a complete lie. It was a complete lie by populists in the United Kingdom in order to pitch this idea that pulling out of the European Union was magically going to save the NHS from all of the economic problems that it has been facing for decades, as the UK has been struggling to find out how they're going to pay for it, as well as not solving the Irish issue. The questions that were not answered before the vote was done, and since then, now that they've actually been slapped in the face with these questions, the British public has more and more and more rejected the idea that Brexit was a good path forward for the country, and they've regretted their decision. And it's right for them to regret their decision. Brexit has hurt their inflation crisis, which is much worse than what the United States has so far faced. It has worse to their labor shortage. It has really hurt the British economy, as well as facing them with multiple geopolitical issues, Ireland just being one of them. And so really, if anything, I think that Brexit, culminated this long British descent from global power status, and it's only going to further worsen it, as it has worsened the amount of influence they're going to have on the world stage to get their people good economic deals. And that's why the majority of British people no longer even agree with Rob, because they were conned. They were conned about the NHS, they weren't talked to about what the results would be in Ireland, and now they regret it.
They weren't conned, and this is an argument that those that sort of, would you call yourself a liberal cuck? This
Where
is
did
something that you
where did the
often
money
see.
come from for the NHS? Where did that come from?
I'm not
Where's
saying
it
that
going?
there weren't people. Of course, there were people on all sides of the issue that were putting money in. Of course, what I'm saying is that what we see over and over again is when those with institutional power don't get their way through the sham of democracy, they enforce hell on people. Just like Destiny, my friend here, supported the riots that were initially going into conversation.
Why do we
had
pivot
with
so
George
hard
Floyd.
to other topics? Just stay on the one
So
topic.
George Floyd,
Stay on
UK,
the one
Brexit, it's all
topic. Oh my
connected very
God.
much.
It's all connected in the sense that people
Yeah.
that willfully want to ignore the fact that there are people in positions of institutional power that intentionally cause pain. That way they could say, oh, see, you shouldn't have voted that way. Shit didn't work out for you. 8 years later, we still didn't keep the democratic promise that we promised you. We just couldn't do it. It was so hard. We, as one of the most established first world governments and historical governments in the world, we couldn't figure it out 8 years on. Oh, shit isn't going so good for you? Geez, maybe you should have voted the way you wanted. Want a referendum? Want to redo it? It's bullshit. It's what
Wait, hold
you
on.
see
Wait, can you
institutional
just
elites do
say
around the world.
Can you just say then? Do you think that all the problems right now in the UK are manufactured then by a salty government that didn't get their way?
No, but I think that it was intentional that they didn't give them Brexit in a way that was a timely fashion. And I think there are people that are impressed that wanted that in Brussels and the UK for it to be
What
made.
was? Wait, there was. Okay, there's a bonger guy here. Yeah, with a hand up. Was there a deal on the table that everybody supported? That was like that had popular support from broadly from the entire population and politicians. Because my understanding is what Brexit would look like exactly was incredibly contentious the entire time post Brexit, the referendum actually passing. You keep trying to
course.
ascribe all this malice, but I don't think it was
Yeah, no,
malice.
I agree with Destiny.
Yeah, it was like people had no
Absolutely, but
fucking. Nobody thought
it was
Brexit was going to
incredibly vague.
happen. Nobody knew what was going to happen.
So it'd be like this, like we wanted to end, like say a country wanted to pull out of the UN. And they would say, we'll pull out of the UN. You would say, a country like the United States, if they did that, and they voted, yeah, we'll pull out of the UN. 8 years later, well, no one exactly agreed the time frame or exactly how the pullout would occur. So
No, Rob, the issue that you're getting at is that, so Dylan Burns brought up that they were conned. You're saying that they weren't conned because they were aware of what they wanted. And what they wanted was to get out of the EU. But everyone else is showing you that it's more complicated than just get out of the EU. The party that wanted Brexit didn't have any kind of plan to get out of the EU, and if that was shown to the people, which it has been now, they would have not voted for Brexit. That's the con.
You know, it's just.
Bro,
It's
stop,
just
stop,
about
stop. No,
people
no, no,
change
hold
their
on.
mind now.
Dude, you can't compare the United Nations to the European Union. The European Union represents far more integration between the member states of the European Union than the fucking UN. Joining and leaving the UN, my guess, is going to be a whatever thing. But actually leaving the European Union, there's a reason why Cameron fucking like moonwalked the fuck out after that shit passed. Nobody had any idea what the country would look like post-Brexit. That was a genuine confusion among the people and the politicians. You have to point to something if you're going to say, we all knew it was going to happen, but the politicians stopped it, because I don't think it's a fair
Do you know
summary
who
at all.
did know what was going to happen? Do you know who did know? The IRA. Because so I did my counterterrorism masters. I spoke to ex-members of the IRA released under the Good Friday Agreement, who said to me, we voted for Brexit because it would radicalize the next generation in Northern Ireland. People fucking knew. And if your argument is, well, globalism's bad, well, this idea that nationalism's just this peachy thing, they're the reason that Cameron wanted to go for Brexit as a vote and actually like debate this was because there was a civil war within the Tory party, and he was worried about the rising vote in UKIP. Because there are people in that institutional power, people from very old money actually for the majority of the hard Brexit side within the Tories, who really do want that real hard exit, who really do want Britain to return to some sort of weird 1800s ideal or return to empire. It's like, and you're saying, well, no one knew what it was going to look like. That's because the people involved in this were on multiple layers of structural power, and no one had a clear vision. Because again, no one's tried leaving an institution like this that's so massive. This idea that, again, Dylan's right. It was a bus with some money on the side of it, which was never achievable because you understand anything about the way the EU funnels its money back into the UK and its member states. Like, it gives massive amounts of that money back. And there are wider problems there that the Tories could have been funding that shit anyway, but just weren't, because again, they control the tax systems. Sorry. Yeah, Dylan.
I'll go after Dylan. Go ahead.
Rob, you wanted to respond to that, so you can go first.
Well, I was just going to say, like, the idea to what you're saying there, Becca, and what Destiny, that it's bigger than something like the UN, like the US pulling out of the UN. Again, that's another lie that was sort of sold to the people in the UK. This was originally supposed to be an economic alliance, that there was supposed to be some sort of voting stakes. There was an organization, this was about economics, and we could see that it became much more than that. It became about who you were forced to allow to leave in your country and other things like that when it came to sovereign borders. So again, it was something that became more, it wasn't voted on democratically. It exerted all sorts of power. And the other thing to say
you
is,
can't just lie. It was voted on democratically. Every
show
single
me-
member.
show me the people in the UK that voted that they were for immigration decisions being allowed by the EU. It was
They weren't even part of the. They're not even. They're not. People in the United Kingdom were not part of the Schengen free movement area. Their immigration is just as much in control today as it was when they were in the European Union. Number one, it is true.
You got freedom of movement in the UK before the EU. We're much more contained now. But
that's why they have a labor shortage.
No. I mean, the UK was not part of the Schengen zone, though. The UK was not part of the Schengen free movement zone, where you have to pass without a passport or whatever. I'm pretty sure you could do passport checks at the UK border.
Yeah, you could do passport.
Yes.
It wasn't quite the same as your. I see what you mean.
Yes,
right,
yeah.
okay.
Number one.
No.
Number two, every single member state of the European Union can elect members of European Parliament, and the European Commission has one member from every single member state, which is where your big decisions are made. So you're voting, if you're in the UK and you've got MEP elections, that's you voting for your representatives that are part of your members of European Parliament that vote on these policies. And number three, Brexit happened. They left. There is a democratic option. There has been the entire time.
They didn't leave. They voted for it and didn't get it. That's what we're talking about.
They did get it. What are you talking
Well,
about?
we've left.
They didn't.
We've left. What are you talking about?
So when I asked you earlier, I said, was Brexit achieved? And you said, no, you were lying.
Well, no, because the idea, but when you say, is Brexit achieved, you're talking about this idea of all the promises being delivered, right? If you're talking about, did Britain leave? Yes, we have left. We have left the European Union. So in that case, yes, Brexit has been achieved. If that's a pure, because again, for a lot of people, there are more questions there of what that looks like, right? It's not just leaving; it's leaving with deals in place, not just for the EU.
There was goals
for all the other countries. And also, I just want to cover one thing with the immigration stuff, because this is one of the biggest myths. This idea that if Britain leaves the EU and suddenly we get control of our borders back, 50% of our immigration is from the colonial countries, within, painkillers, but so we could have cut down on our immigration without leaving the EU ages ago. We just didn't do it. So again, it is the political class lying about what's achievable because they're trying to spin a narrative. Because also Boris wanted to get into fucking power. That's why he led the campaign. Because he was like, that's how I'll become prime minister. And in the long term, it worked. That's why people voted for him. It's why he's still popular, despite being one of the worst prime ministers in human fucking history.
Okay, I wanna pause y'all real quick just because I do feel like it's Rob versus the panel right now. So I want to give it to Dylan because he had a couple of minutes, and then I want to give it to Nevin because I see him dutifully taking notes. So Dylan, Nevin, and then back to the panel.
So when we talk about also the United States and the UK, I think as Americans it's also kind of hard for us to understand that the UK is just not the beast that it used to be. It is no longer the empire which the sun never sets. It is now the land of, you know, football, chips and biscuits. It's basically just what we know as the UK when we see it, think of an image of it in our minds. And it's a nation of what, about 80 million people probably? Something around that range or something in that area. And it does not have the financial influence that the United States has. Of 330 million people, one of the most prosperous nations of the world, one of the biggest GDP, it does not have as much influence as we do on the world stage when it comes to going on the world stage and trading. And so the idea that the UK, I think, and this was like almost like the pitch, I think, from a lot of the right wing in Britain, that they would make their way about the world like the United States does, going to this economic union, saying, I'm going to make this deal with you, going to these countries on his own and making these deals with you. But what it really did is just make it harder for it to negotiate the agreements that they had to renew. 45% of their imports come from the EU. That's like 250 billion pounds. 42% of their exports come from the European Union. Their trade is like 50-50 with the EU. This is something that was extremely beneficial with them and that they developed over 50 to 60 years that they had to undo. Yeah, that took some time. When David Cameron put it up to a vote, I'm confident he had 100% belief that it would get shot down and this would basically be the death blow in this movement. Then it didn't, and then they had to deliver on it, and his government couldn't do it, so he resigned, and then they handed it over to Theresa May. They tried, they failed in doing it, so they handed it over to Boris Johnson, mophead. He was able to finally deliver it over, hand it over to Liz Truss, and now the Conservatives are plummeting because of the mess they made, and now the Labour Party is surging, and Keir Starmer, somebody that was seen as like a wash rag when it comes to his popularity and ability to give a speech, might actually become prime minister if things keep going as it is. They've made a mess, and now they're dealing with it.
They made a mess because they didn't implement the actual Brexit as it was promised in places like UKIP that people wanted.
But they didn't get. They were never going to get the promises of all the money for the NHS. They never really even combated the idea of Ireland. The inflation crisis that they've been feeling in the UK is partially due to this. What about the labor shortage? They did not explain exactly what the full consequences of unveiling this new path for the UK would be, and now they're feeling the consequences of it. The majority of British people don't like it.
The problem is when you say they didn't implement the promises, it's because they had no way of implementing the promises, right? Like a promise of like, we're going to redo all of these trades unilaterally, and then Brexit goes through and they haven't done yet. That's not like the people got tricked. Or they did, but they got tricked by the people pushing Brexit. It's not like they had those deals in place and then for some reason the shadow government said, no, we're not going to do it. That was never going to happen. That was a fantasy.
All right, I'm a pause it real quick just because I've seen Nevin dutifully taking notes. And again, you guys take the conversation where you want to go. I'm not going to guide you too much, but obviously, like what I've heard is will of the people versus it's complex. That's what I've heard so far. Not why is globalism good? Why is nationalism good? What's the justification for these things in flux? I'm hearing, popular will.
I mean, look at Britain's economy right now.
Well, I don't want to argue. I don't want to argue with the panel myself, even though I'm very passionate about this subject myself. So, Nevin, please read us your notes, and then let's take it from there.
One of the things I want to reel back here, and Rob touched upon this, is the notion of this sort of elite malevolence or whatnot. And I think one aspect of globalism, particularly corporate globalism, it is something that is intentional, in part because of ideology as well as profits. And you see this with different trade agreements with PNTR for Russia, PNTR for China, and things of that nature. Yes, it started out as a foreign policy project, but it was deliberate. And it hurt Americans. I know several in the panel would disagree with me, but it hurt our national security to a degree. It's hurt our capacity to innovate. And we saw that, of course, with COVID, with PPEs and things of that nature. And so I wanted to kind of reel it back. I don't think it's just entirely inevitable globalism, but it is something that is consciously steered as a political and economic project. So
Okay, I'll move on just from Brexit, but I'll say this: like, you can even find. I'm not going to claim that to know all of the sides of these issues. I don't claim to be an expert, but I will say that there is a lot of information that the folks in Brussels intentionally wanted to cause pain on the UK, including with the situation in Ireland and other places. And what would have been done is the default would be, just because you're not in an official government body, a world government body, there's still the default would be that people in Europe could trade with people in Europe, even if unilateral deals had to be made. I don't dismiss the idea that that would be more difficult than being in the organization, but the plus sides of it would be that your governance could be more local, and you're not just sending someone off to Brussels that's not representing you, because it's this government, you're only one part of this globalist body. But instead of encouraging that free trade situation, we saw that Brussels actively attempted to harm the UK and then deal things in a way that made them more sort of protectionist in order to dissuade other countries from leaving this globalist initiative. And that's a lesson for globalism, that
Well,
they
what
will
was
always...
what was
Go ahead.
something that the EU did that you thought was unfair? What did Brussels do to punish the UK?
Like, for example, like, here's one article that I'm reading. We'll just go here. Brussels weaponized Northern Ireland to punish UK for Brexit, says expert. As clashes continue in Northern Ireland, commentator and historian Ruth Dudley Edwards claimed the EU has used the state to put maximum pressure on the UK to agree to a Brexit deal. Although there were alternatives to the protocol, Ms. Dudley Edwards insisted Boris Johnson had been forced to accept a deal that impedes trade between Britain and North Ireland due to his predecessor. Despite agreeing to a deal, the commentator also warned Brussels had chosen to interpret the custom rules as strictly as possible to inflict maximum damage to the UK. And these were the sort of things. Now, I'll admit, a lot of this I was hearing from people that were pro-Brexit, like UKIP people, that were saying when the deal was initially, or when this was initially voted for, that the people of Brussels were talking about things such as, well, then we won't do trade deals. We won't do that. And the Brexit people were saying, well, why would you cut off your nose to spite your face? We could still trade just because we don't think that we need this international body that we think's been taking away the sovereignty of our people. But they continue to issue more sort of protectionist policy. Do you agree or disagree with that, Dylan, that there was more sort of protectionist policies from Brussels post-Brexit vote than pre?
It doesn't sound like, to be clear, it doesn't sound like there's any new policy at all. What you just said, I don't know what article you're reading from, but what you just said was they decided to strictly enforce the rules on the books. That sounds like policy that was already in place. Not only was a policy in place, it was policy in place that the UK already knew about. And it has to do with an issue that existed between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, meaning that Brexit exacerbated this issue, not Brussels. I don't think you can get mad at Brussels for enforcing the rules on the books.
Well, no.
If the worst thing you've got is they were really mean because they enforced the rules that already existed, and that's an argument against globalism, are we going to say like globalism caused like the IRA and like Northern Ireland and pre-Good Friday and like what? I'm sorry. I don't know.
I'll be real quick on this. Two things. One, the idea that, well, there was a law in the books, but still the way that you enforce that. We see this with trade policies all over the place. You can see with the World Trade Organization, there are laws on the books, but the way that they are enforced from country to country oftentimes could be something that's disputed. So they chose to take the most hardline interpretation possible. And also I'm saying that there were all sorts of discussions that were occurring in Brussels about intentionally punishing the UK. If you'd like, I could pull articles up of that as well, where they were going to intentionally publish them because they were saying they wanted to dissuade other member states from leaving because they thought that it would cause a cascade effect that would end up dissolving the union.
Okay, I mean, if they did something unfair, that'd be cool. But like, when the first thing you have is like, well, they enforced the rules in the books. I mean, that's not very compelling to me. But
I think it's a little crazy that the nationalist side is arguing, well, Northern Ireland has a large nationalist contingent that may want to like have sovereignty, and in some ways, Brussels supporting their right to sovereignty is bad because globalism. Like, this is a pre-existing issue. It didn't just pop out of fucking nowhere. Like, this has been going on since fucking Cromwell. Like, it's not new. It's just like Brussels.
I can't tell if Rob is just like frantically searching for like. I feel like Rob has no idea what he's talking about on any of these topics. I feel he's just looking for like.
Was right, and also you've got to understand, like with Southern Ireland,
Southern
Ireland is very closely linked to the EU because it's how Southern Ireland managed to, like the Republic, actually recovered. So this idea of like the EU just being like, nah, yeah, it doesn't really matter, because that's then an open border, which again is the very thing so many people in Brexit were like, well, we can't have those. Well, it exists, and you can't have passport checks across the sea between Britain and Northern Ireland because they're part of the union. It's a massively complicated situation that no one considered. Destiny's right. Like, and this isn't just like some magical thing that Brussels did. It's an ongoing historic UK issue.
Dylan, before you go, I never want to hear the phrase "Brussels was right" ever again on my panel. But
I can't believe we've reached the point where I'm saying this. Of all
You're
people,
wrong. You're
what
wrong.
are you doing to me?
Because they would have been able to, through technology, they could have had ways to get around sort of this dispute, right? And that's the article I was reading.
Wait, what? How does technology solve any of this?
Well, the border dispute, right? We could have had a way because, well, let me finish. So, Beckett, I'll trust you to answer this, right? Because you.
No. I really want to hear how technology gets these Irish over their past shit. I want to hear about it.
I'm asking an initial question, right? So the dispute is sort of if the EU was left, if Brexit occurred, then there would be land disputes by sort of the sovereignty of who was able to come through.
I don't think... Is Robbie about to talk about Irish troubles and have no idea what the fuck's going on with North and South Ireland? Uh-oh.
Sort of this Ireland, into Ireland, correct?
Sure.
Right, and so that would have immigration problems with that, would also have economic trade issues and things that could arise from that. So the problem would be, how would we be able to make sure that the people that were getting across were legitimately allowed to be there and things like that? And the article I was reading talks about they had something that they had suggested let me see.
Wait, hold on, real quick, Beckett. Okay, somebody can tell me if I'm right or wrong here. I'm sorry, hold on. The problem between Ireland and Northern Ireland, the problem between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland wasn't like logistically, how do we make the border work? My issue was it was a, I don't know, spiritual thing of like, we're going to make an agreement that there shall not exist a border between these two areas ever again because of the conflict that's occurred historically here, because the bombings, the violence that happened up through the late 20th century even. Like, I'm pretty sure in the early, when was a Good Friday? Was it the early 90s? Fuck, when was a Good Friday agreement? Yeah, like that was the point of preventing any border from existing. It's not a matter of having an efficient border, it's that there was supposed to be no borders, regardless of technology.
So just to clarify as well, because again, people focus on the IRA issue. So here's the problem. The argument is you can have a border between Southern Ireland, like the Republic and the North. But the last time we did that, you have to have those borders manned, and that's what led to the IRA. And it's what led to a large amount of terrorism or freedom fighters, however you want to think about it and look at those groups. Now, the other argument was, okay, well, fine. We'll let the border be open, but then we'll allow like checks at the airports. But what people don't talk about is the Unionists and the DUP, who basically said, if you have passport checks at the airports, you're denying our right to easy free travel between the rest of the UK and the North, and we'll fucking riot. So it's not a simple case, because again, Ireland isn't just a simple situation of going, well, it's just the IRA. The old joke with Ireland is that a man pulls up to the border and he gets asked, are you a Catholic or a Protestant? He says, I'm an atheist. And they look at each other.
I just want to say real quick, it's so funny because Rob is so confident. He's so good at debating.
Yeah,
he has no idea what he's talking about at all right now.
He doesn't know anything about the Irish
He has no
troubles.
idea what any of these issues are. It's very funny to me. He's just like trudging forward on this shit. The reason why he's talking about like passport control and shit is because he thinks that for Ireland it was just like illegal immigrants. He's like, are Mexicans fleeing to Northern Ireland? Is that why they need stronger border protection? That's just really funny. Yeah.
They have every right to.
I do want to.
Go ahead.
Dylan's been waiting for a minute, so let Dylan go first.
I do have to point out the kind of like the irony here of the UK going on a nationalist crusade of protecting their borders. Then they finally get it by the skin of their teeth, and then immediately when they find out that the toll of of protecting their borders includes trampling on the Good Friday Agreement, immediately that goes away in favor of the globalist cuck deal that they did called the Good Friday Agreement. They do this agreement to protect their borders, have strong borders, and that immediately was their downfall when it came to Ireland. And then they ended up fucking over the DUP, who is allied with the Conservative Party, which caused a lot of infighting because they were essential for some of the early governments, definitely during Theresa May's administration. So I mean, this is something that they brought upon themselves, and they should have kind of seen from a mile away, but also wasn't talked about at the time. And we keep saying that it was the propaganda that changed all these people, and now make it that it's like 54 to 30% of British people now believe it was a bad mistake. Maybe it's now that they're feeling the full effects of these decisions, they're regretting them, and maybe they didn't consider all of the factors that were going to come involved, including the Northern Ireland issue. And now the populist position in Brexit, in the United Kingdom, is to re-enter the European Union because it was a good, beneficial deal for them.
Again, we could get into other things other than I'll just say the end on this. There was something called the Smart Trader, the UK Smart Trader scheme, and this was something that sought to use sort of new technology and things like that, where businesses could sign up to ensure that there would be duty-free and tariff-free goods that would be able to be sent from Great Britain to Ireland. These are the sort of things that were being pushed against by Brussels. They were saying that it had to be more of a hardline separation, and these tariffs needed to exist. What I'm saying, though, is that Brussels intentionally, as internal communication said, discussed punishing the UK because they wanted to avoid people to avoid this. What you can't get around is that it took years and years for them to even attempt to withdraw from Brexit. You could say, well, it was really hard, it was difficult. I refuse to believe that they were unable to get this done in a couple of years. There might have been hiccups along the way, but they didn't even attempt to amend them and implement it. And instead, what you saw was right out of the gate, the same people that were against Brexit in the first place started saying, well, that democracy doesn't count, we want a new referendum. This is how globalists control the flow of information, and they're able to always say that when there are democratic initiatives in nation states that go against their agenda, that they will seek to punish them and ignore that form of democracy. This is one issue. We could talk about globalism in the form of the World Health Organization, the WEF, and their agendas that seek, you guys got your globalist dream, right? With the lockdown, so you got it. You got what they wanted, right? And what did we see? A massive redistribution of wealth from the poor and working class to the upper class.
So just to be clear,
in a nutshell.
so you restated your thesis on this like several times, but you haven't proved this at all. So we can move on from Brexit. I think Brexit is a really good example of globalism versus non-globalism. I think you failed to substantiate your point ever. The biggest argument you brought forward was that Brussels enforced policy on the books, and if the UK wanted some say in that policy, they probably should have remained in the European Union in order to have a say. But they left, so they didn't, and that's it.
Topic 2 is, much criticism has been made about the U.S. aid to Ukraine and Taiwan because it angers our rivals while being of little importance to the quote-unquote defense of the Western world. That being said, there are legitimate accusations of human rights abuses by both Russia and China in their territories. Should the U.S. or the West be involved at all? What lines do we draw? Should we be militarily responsible for these territories? What is our interest, and how are they served by globalism or nationalism balanced in reference to these issues? Since Dylan is the only person who's risked getting his balls blown off in the past decade in reference to these topics, I'm going to start with him.
Could you give me the last part of the question again?
So, should the U.S. or West be involved in the conflicts with Taiwan and Ukraine in general? What lines should we draw as a country not involved? Should we be militarily responsible for these territories? What is our interest, and how are they served by either globalism as a philosophy or nationalism as a philosophy? Okay, I know I gave you like 5 questions.
Yeah, there's like 5 questions. I'll answer what I can. So I do think that we should support both Ukraine and Taiwan. I think we have a good interest in doing both. I mean, Taiwan, you could make a very selfish kind of national security interest of they produce 50% of the world's like very advanced microchips. And until the United States has proven itself through the CHIPS Act to be able to match that type of production capacity, a lot of our weapons, including a lot of our computers and our domestic industry and just our country, run on the computer chips that are made in Taipei. And so I think it's good for us to be allied with somebody who holds such a vital resource and to support them. Also, in our support of Taiwan, the bigger the disincentive for the Chinese to invade is, the more likely the war games they play end in failure for them, the less likely they are to invade. The bigger the price for invasion, the less likely you are going to try to invade. I do believe that the United States should not be the only one backing up Taiwan, though. I think it should be a general Pacific coalition between the United States, Japan, South Korea, and possibly other nations in the region in order to support Taiwanese defense. I do not think this should solely fall on the United States soldiers, not only because it increases our odds of defending Taiwan, but also because this should not be our sole responsibility. Because the effects of invading Taiwan is not only going to affect the United States, which would most likely be the recipient of many Taiwanese refugees, but it would also affect other nations in the area economically, as well as they would become awash with refugees. I don't know if that's the right word to use. China also agrees that refugees is within a nation's self-interest. That's part of the reason why they prop up the North Korean state so much, is because they don't want tens of millions of North Koreans. Well, there's I don't know exactly how many North Koreans there are, but they don't want the millions of North Koreans crossing the border in a massive refugee crisis at a war started at the Kim's will. As for Ukraine, I believe that what's happening right now is a violation of their sovereignty. We're seeing some of the worst human atrocities going on in Ukraine, with the largest mass grave in Europe since the Yugoslav genocides uncovered in Izium with 440 bodies. I don't really feel like I need to go through the laundry list of war crimes or atrocities committed by the Russians in Ukraine and how much it has decreased the standard of living. But in Ukraine, they have made their will pretty well known. They want to push the Russians out. They want their country to be free. They want to uphold the Euromaidan revolution and continue to develop their institutions, make them stronger as they go after things like corruption and oligarchical control over things like media, police, and other industries. And I think that their membership in the European Union and integration with Europe is what is best for their country's development. In fact, this whole war started over Ukraine wanting to be part of the European project, the Russians starting to mold over it, and starting this whole mess in the first place when they started engaging in economic coercion then. I think we should support the Ukrainians in their national defense. I hope they win the war, and I guess we can get into the other issues later.
I appreciate you, brother. Next geopolitical nerd on the panel, Nevin, please take it away.
Yeah, a radical civic nationalist. I mean, I take a strong stand within reason against Russia and China and their allies throughout the world. They do seek, in my opinion, global hegemony, which obviously would affect the United States. Putin in recent years has talked about recreating with China an entire new world order, if you will. Dmitry Medvedev rather recently had pointed out that he wants a Eurasia in Europe expanded from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And that's going to ultimately pose a major national security risk to the United States. If Ukraine goes, there's a real possibility that Russia will continue to expand westward. We know they've been providing funds to various extreme parties in Europe, like the National Front. In France, they've had ties with sort of quasi-tanky organizations as well as some neo-national socialist organizations, and they're all united by a common anti-Americanism. I think in the case of Taiwan, I think we need to back them too as well. My biggest concern is, of course, in backing Taiwan, Ukraine, and whatnot, my concern about also getting into a risk with war with Russia and China is they have tremendous nuclear potential. China can potentially embargo the United States of goods. I mean, Lenin talked about back in 1921, or I think it was Stalin actually, the rear of imperialism, where the third world at the time, the colonies, produced the raw materials and now, of course, manufactured goods. They can just say, well, fuck you, we're cutting this shit off, you sink or swim. And that's a concern that we have to, really take into account. And then there's the other issue where up until, to some degree recently, Germany was a huge violator, even during the Cold War on this, is we have these allies, yes, but they have been violating back in the Cold War, the COCOM trade, not embargo, but I'm sure you know what COCOM was, which was an export control organization, very thinly staffed. And meanwhile, West Germany, Japan, Taiwan, they have channeled technology to their very gravediggers. So it is a complex issue, but we need to take these things seriously because with all the beauties of interconnectedness and all the rest of it, these are major problems. And sometimes, I don't want to get on a tangent, but the other part with even our allies, sometimes they don't like what we do either, like Switzerland, because they opposed the war against Iraq. They embargoed special crystals that were used for our gravity bombs. You look at what Belgium did during the Vietnam War. They embargoed certain rotor parts for our Huey helicopters. You look at even natural disasters in Japan.
Devin,
like,
I need to move
Sorry,
it on
guys.
the intro. This is part of the reason why I had you go after Dylan, though, because I felt like you guys would find a kindred spirit in geopolitical nerdiness. So I appreciate both of you.
And there's some
Beckett?
alignment, honestly, with Dylan and I. We're more sympathetic, certainly, to Ukraine and Taiwan than China and Russia. I mean,
Then let's get into those nuances and interesting things in the general. Mr. Beckett, can you please give us, the Western interest in Ukraine and Taiwan and how philosophically globalism and nationalism apply?
Yeah, I think you have to stand for something. I think a lot of issues kind of begin to really raise their heads when we look at what happened in Hong Kong as well. Because if we're not going to even comment or exert any kind of real pressure, I don't know if we can say we really believe in things. Yes, we should absolutely be supporting Ukraine, not just because it's about sovereignty against an aggressing state, but actually because of what it says about the rest of European stability. Dylan is absolutely right. The European project, ultimately, and why it's important, is it's the longest period of peace in Europe's history. People want to talk about the shared European experience. Well, the shared European experience is a millennia of warfare, basically. Ultimately, yeah, we should step in if we can. Military stuff, like direct military intervention, we all know from World War II how that can escalate from small states having big friends, and we want to avoid that. But ultimately, I think pretty much everyone, I imagine, would agree that World War II was a war worth fighting, right? And there are some things worth paying costs for.
We need to get Charlie Kirk on the panel to see whether or not he thought World War II was worth fighting. But Destiny and then Rob. So Destiny, please share your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Ukraine are the good guys, so we should support them, based. I could say a bunch, but I'm just going to end up reiterating what everybody else said. I think that if the United States has any authority in the world, then some of that authority should probably be used to reinforce the stability of Europe and maintaining countries' sovereignty and not allowing bully countries to invade them, and to respect territorial sovereignty from established countries that we all recognize are established countries is probably a really important thing for us to support. So, yeah.
All right, Mr. Rob.
Yeah, so I'll be happy to be the one that disagrees with the majority of this. First, I'll say this is a precursor, though I shouldn't have to. I don't like Putin. I don't like Russia. I hope Ukraine wins the war tomorrow. I don't give a shit. And like when the United States invaded Iraq, I don't like that Russia invaded Ukraine. That doesn't mean that the United States, NATO, and globalism didn't push for this outcome to be inevitable, as I've had discussions with Dylan Burns in the past, where he admitted with the boondoggle that we are in with Syria was in part about pressuring an ally of Putin in Assad. When I asked him if he thought that that could possibly lead to Putin getting upset and lashing out, he said he wasn't worried about it, and now it's something that unfortunately we should have been worried about. Just like 9/11 is the fault of the terrorists that committed the act, that doesn't mean Ron Paul was incorrect when he said that we took steps that made something like 9/11 more likely to occur. That's exactly what the United States has done in places like Ukraine. You want to talk about national sovereignty in places like Ukraine? The poor people of Ukraine haven't had true national sovereignty for decades, ever since they've left the Soviet Union. In fact, it's been a cesspit of corruption for interests that were pro-Putin, or pro-Russia, I should say, not pro-Putin. And then in 2014 and other places, we saw as a geopolitical strategy for NATO, European Union, the United States in particular, to actually have a chance, whether it be through a color revolution and NGOs that they were having there that helped lead to the ouster of the president there for a more U.S. friendly president and European Union friendly president. Regardless if that was a led color revolution or not, we could see what the net effect of that was. We saw that the United States and the Obama State Department was basically creating an FBI in Ukraine called the NABU, and that NABU was then being told by George Kent and others at the State Department who and who not they were allowed to prosecute. So their very FBI or their agencies were at the whim of other countries saying, if you want this money, this is what we'll do. Of course, we could go with Joe Biden's infamous quid pro quo, where they had to fire a prosecutor in order to get this money from the United States. The Ukraine situation is a boondoggle that's leading us closer and closer to World War III. Instead of attempting to have a peaceful resolution, we are listening to propaganda, which sadly people like my friend Dylan Burns there have bought into. He told me about 8 months ago that the war was already over, that Russia had lost, they had no chance of winning. It was just a matter of time. And now, just like all the people in the United States. He says, but we just need a few more billion, just a few more billion, because they'll be on the shores of Poland if we don't continue to send this money. It is a lie. It is being used for corrupt reasons. The globalists always do this. Look at Libya. We were told that they were bad people. Look at Iraq. We were told they were bad people. And in all of these cases, the situation is worse than when we entered it. So it's a disaster. And even if you think there are times when the U.S. should intervene, the U.S. has lost credibility, as has the globalist order in places like the EU, because of so many times that they've lied and been corrupt and instigating these wars and having terrible outcomes in the countries.
All right, Nevin, it is technically open, but I want Nevin to go first since he hasn't participated as much as everybody else. And then after that, it's just open for everybody to fight. So Nevin, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to throw shade on my fellow nationalists here, but also the corporate globalists. During the debate for permanent normal trade relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia, they all were falling over themselves, ExxonMobil, Boeing, etc., in saying, the Cold War is over. Well, let's trade with Russia and totally decontrol our technology. To look at even some American businesses like Koch Industries and its subsidiaries, they are libertarian globalists, as you know. They fund the Cato Institute, AFP, Freedom Works, the Hellnut Club for Growth, which are economic globalists, and they're still in Russia despite the sanctions. So I see the globalists really also, as much as corporate globalists, let me specify, more in bed with the enemies of the United States, the adversaries of the West. I'm not trying to throw shade at my fellow nationalists, but one of the reasons why I've turned against corporate globalism, I used to be, again, a big free trade person, is because they constantly go to bat and give legitimacy for adversaries. And I'm sure many of you know this already. So when it comes to Ukraine, look, Russia, they still have, despite their battlefield performances against the U.S. supported Ukrainians, they still are a force that I would not want to reckon with, particularly with their nuclear arsenal. It's not something I want to poke the bear in, but we also cannot abandon, however imperfect Ukraine is, just like South Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, etc. We can't abandon them and simply leave all this Ukrainian industry, Ukrainian.
Let me ask you. I'm not interrupting. You're trying to interject. I want to ask you. What is the American interest in Ukraine?
The American interest in Ukraine is that we don't set an example that we're just abandoning allies and then emboldening dictators with global hegemony ambitions to then march onto Europe. As I mentioned, Russia is not going to just stop at Ukraine. They are seeking to influence Hungary through its political parties like Jobbik, Poland, through left-wing and so-called right-wing parties, Germany, the same thing over and over again. And because, unfortunately, we are so intertwined economically with these countries, the moment that Russia or China gains hegemony, they're going to use pressure and say, well, we're going to cut off goods to the United States. Now, yes, I know this is a what-if scenario, but frankly, if I was a leader of the United States, I would not want to engage in that scenario. And another topic that I'm going
to I want to make sure that it's open so we can fight, but throw out the other topic and then let's fight.
Is also we need to also look at industrial policy in the United States. And that's not just a progressive, slow, gradual implementation of tariffs, but also a whole host of massive investments in tuition-free university colleges for engineering graduates, scientists, computer programmers, everything, welders, whatnot, to rebuild your knowledge base. You got to reindustrialize the United States to a degree. Sure, we could trade with other countries based on product quality. But we don't. Here we're talking about, oh my God, if they influence Europe, they invade Taiwan, we're going to lose our chips and stuff like that. That to me is a problem. We should not allow that much of an export of strategic industries to.
Hey, Dylan, if you don't mind, if I could jump in here real quick. Dylan, you said like 6 months ago that Russia had no chance of winning. How many more billions do we need to send before that fulfills?
It's already been fulfilled. They haven't won. It's been a year of fighting, and they haven't achieved any of their strategic objectives.
Okay,
they haven't taken the Donbass.
More money then. They've lost. That's what you said.
Wait. Okay. Listen to me for a moment. What I said when I was talking to you 6 months ago was that the Russians will not be able to achieve their original strategic objectives. And that's true. Their regional strategic objective was not, well, let's take half of Kherson, let's take half of Zaporozhye, let's take 2/3 of the Donbass, and that should be enough. The original strategic objective was to overthrow the Ukrainian government. When that failed, then it was moved to, well, we're going to demilitarize Ukraine, we're going to take all of the Donbass, we're going to stop them from joining any alliances, and all of that they have been unable to achieve so far. I mean, some of it blatantly and evidently. For example, when it comes to the expansion of NATO, Finland and Sweden are at the door of NATO, actively banging on the door to get in. Now, that's one thing. That's Russian victory. What I want is Ukrainian victory. I want the Russians out of Ukraine. I want there to be an obvious and clear penalty for what the Russians did. I want the Ukrainians to be free, and I don't want them to have to sign the death warrant of their neighbors as we uncover more and more of these mass graves. I don't want to permanently doom these people to Russian occupation. That's what I want to see. I want to see Ukrainian victory, not just Russian loss.
Who to Russian occupation?
Ukrainians.
Okay, but you said, so you're saying when you told me months ago that Russia already lost, it was just a matter of time, so we needed to spend money to speed up that time frame. Now you're saying there is a potential, if we would stop sending money, there is a chance that Russia would achieve victory in the sense that they would be able to permanently occupy parts of Ukraine.
That's not Russian victory. Just holding on to Crimea and getting pushed out of every other part of Ukraine was not the Russian objective. Right?
That's fair enough, but that's not what I was led to believe. What Dylan was saying earlier.
Let me ask you a question, Rob. Let's say that I said we're going to invade Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein. Then we invade Iraq. Then we take, like, I don't know, like 1/10 of Iraq. And then I was like, well, our new goal is actually take 3/10 of Iraq. Then we maybe get to like 1.5/10 of Iraq. And I'm like, well, our new goal. At that point, you're like, okay, American victory is obviously not being achieved. Now the question of Iraqi victory, the idea of them completely pushing out the Americans, that's the new question. Russian victory of the idea of the original goal plus the goals they set afterwards, none of those are being achieved in the near future, at least in my goals. I don't see it being achieved permanently. I don't see how they take Kramatorsk where they've had so many problems with Bakhmut. Definitely when the Ukrainians have already taken back over 50% of the territory that the Russians taken since the February 24th invasion.
All right, if I could real quick, because I know Beckett wants to jump in, so I'll just say that I was not led to believe that that's what you were talking about. I will go back to the film and see exactly what you said, but I was led to believe that you said that Russia would be defeated, not in, they would be able to maintain parts of Ukraine, but not overthrow Zelensky. That's not what I got. But go ahead.
Okay, well, at no point did I ever imply that I know the Ukrainians are going to liberate Crimea. At no point did I ever imply that at any point. I don't think I did, at least.
Okay, nonetheless, what I will say, even accepting now what you're re-clarifying, I'll accept that that's your re-clarification, though I am going to go back and look, but I'll accept that. Still, you're saying then that there is a potential, if we would stop financing Ukraine right now, that Russia would be able to hold on to parts of Ukraine in perpetuity. That's what you're saying.
It's a possibility, yes.
So it doesn't sound like the resounding defeat that many of the pro-Ukrainian people are saying, that Russia doesn't have a chance. It sounds like that, like I had said when I last talked to you, that it seems to be a damn stalemate without any path to victory for either side really pushed forward. I think it's a quagmire where billions are going to be continued to descend.
It is a quagmire, but I think a quagmire is, if it's not a resounding victory for Ukraine, a quagmire is a resounding defeat for Russia, right? I think we're forgetting what the landscape looked like a year ago, where me included, and a lot of military analysts were predicting that Ukraine was going to fall in like 2 weeks, that Zelensky would be gone, there'd be a new regime installed, and then we would have Russia, Belarus, and to the south, Belarus 2.0, in less than a month. So the fact that Russia has been pushed out of every single part of Ukraine except for Crimea is a resounding defeat for Russia. Like, yeah,
but
pushing and taking back Crimea.
To my point.
That's fine if it's irrelevant, but I'm just saying that, like, to say that, like, oh, well, you guys said that Russia was going to get their ass kicked, and look, they're still holding on to Crimea by the skin of their teeth. I don't think it's the resounding victory or them holding on as well as they'd like to be.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is a Russian victory. What I'm saying is there are two positions coming out of the people's mouth. One is that Russia's getting their ass kicked, and like Dylan said, they have no chance of achieving victory. They have none. That's what he told me. But on the other hand, we have to continue to send billions every month, because if we don't, they'll be on the border of Poland. This is bullshit.
Wait, hold on. Wait, what? No.
Who are you debating?
No one is saying they're going to be on the border pulling out. Russia's military is a paper tiger, right? That's been established. Like, that's over. But the idea right now, by sending money to Ukraine, is to accelerate to the end of the war. Like, no matter what happens at this point, like, Yeah.
Everyone who supports this on the panel admits there's no chance that Russia's going to come fuck with the United States or other European country. No chance. They're paper tiger. They don't have a chance of that. We're admitting that.
They might invade Moldova. I think Moldova is like the clear other option they would go after, since it's not in NATO and it's not in the EU, and they already got Russian troops in Moldova anyway. And there's actually news from Moldova that they might be trying to orchestrate coups and format stuff there. But besides Moldova, it'd be very difficult for them to try anything anywhere else.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be any formal invasion of Poland or anything. No,
I would love for Biden to admit that. I would love for Biden to come out and say there's no chance Russia can do anything. They're a paper tiger. This is literally just about
Russia is
Ukraine.
never going to invade any NATO country ever.
That's not what we're being implied through our government and through the NATO countries that are saying we have to fight them over there so we don't fight them over here.
You do, but wait. Russia's goal is to shrink NATO and abolish NATO. And also, let me ask you a question: if you got the opportunity to abolish NATO, would you abolish NATO?
Yes.
So okay, so there are also Americans who are trying to see America leave NATO and make it easier for Russia to invade countries in Europe in the future, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
Your exact words were, Russia could be expanding and invaded Ukraine because of globalism and NATO expansion. That's what you said in your opening statement, and then you reiterated in this that in this section you also talked about acceptance into the EU and NATO. So your globalism helped cause this war. Great job.
When Rob is
what
done,
you just said is completely incomprehensible. I have no clue what you just tried to get across to me.
let's pause it there real quick. Nevin is a Xer, so he's a little bit more polite than us younger Zoomer millennials who just yell at each other and shit. So I want to let him in real quick. So Mr. Nevin, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, Russia, and this was put on steroids under Gorbachev's reign when you look at declassified Soviet documents that were leaked out by Vladimir Bukovsky and Pavel Stroilov, for example. And it shows that in one particular document, I quote, Gorbachev was saying that he wanted to basically evict the Americans from Europe and hug Europe to death. And that project has continued under Putin. So one of the few areas that Russia is semi-effective is through propaganda, political warfare, and disinformation. And that's something that has carried over under Yeltsin and Putin. You have various FSB and SVR defectors, some of whom have written books. I've had whole segments with geopolitical experts on this on my show, some of who I disagree on a bunch of other issues. Sergei Tretyakov, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, Konstantin Przebrzydzinski, and Viktor and Marina Kalashnikov, and others. And, the evidence piles up. They do have designs on Europe. Are they going to invade tomorrow? No, although Putin has made threatening remarks to former Ukrainian President Poroshenko saying, well, I could march in to be in Romania or Tallinn and Estonia. I might be misquoting some of the cities, in 48 hours. Maybe he can, maybe he can't. But that's not something that I would just slough under the carpet.
I mean, this is something I kind of want to just extract outwards as well, because I've been really careful, generally speaking, not to speak too much on Ukraine, because I'm not an expert. I don't actually know anywhere near as much as Dylan does, and I think that's dangerous when you've got a counterterrorism masters, and people might take you a bit too seriously. But let's just zoom out onto what's surrounding Ukraine and the kind of European political situation. Many of the border states that used to be Russian controlled still run militias. I've got friends in them, and when Ukraine was invaded, people who'd been in militias since they were 13 were all called up for exercises. This heightens tensions, and that again leads to kind of this disunity, because you've got some states in kind of like Europe with France, Germany that are kind of progressed in the way away from gun ownership or away from militias, and then you've got the states who are like, well, Russia could come back tomorrow. From the responsibility side, which is really, I think, what we're trying to talk about, of course we have a responsibility to this, because this idea of, well, why are Americans helping? Well, do you want to destabilize Europe?
A very early Middle Eastern war.
If it costs billions of dollars to create that sort of security with one of your largest trading partners, you'd be insane not to do it. It's not if you want to talk about this idea of American exceptionalism, why shouldn't you? If you believe that your way of life, that the American ideal is something that you should fight for and protect, then you shouldn't just be fighting for and protecting it in your home borders. You should be fighting and protecting for those ideas of democracy, sovereignty, because again, you're on the nationalist side arguing, like, should we be helping a nation, like, establish its national role and rights and, like, self-dependence. But at the same time, you know, we've had this conversation with multiple places. And whenever we say, nah, maybe it's not our problem, it weakens the West. It makes us look weak. And we end up buying into the kind of Russian propaganda that they've spewed out for the last sort of decade and a half, that their military was this great, all-powerful, incredibly advanced, ready to take on the West. And it wasn't. It wasn't even ready to take on Ukraine, you know. And it's kind of funny to see history repeat itself, because this is exactly what happened with Russia before the fall of the Tsar when they went to war with Japan. Easy victory, guys. We'll go to war with Japan. Everyone hold a parade. And by the end of it, they'd lost to a tiny fucking nation barely anyone in Russia had even heard of. You know, like this idea that we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine. I don't understand why you'd want a more powerful Russia. Am I fucking missing something here? It just seems crazy to hear like nationalists talk about it this way. I don't understand it.
Dylan wanted to talk, but I'll happily respond. But Dylan, I don't.
He said it first. I don't want to interrupt the flow. I'll respond later.
You sure?
We'll talk
Okay.
later. Yeah, that's fine.
Again, it's not pro-Putin. This is what this is sort of the dialectic that we see happen. There's a bunch of bad decisions that people like me warn. Look, we're meddling in other countries' affairs. We're expanding NATO. This military alliance getting closer and closer. We're doing all kinds of shit. You want to talk about sovereignty? Packett, I wonder, were you talking about sovereignty when the United States was bombing Syria? In the Trump and Biden administration? Did you talk about that? Did you talk about sovereignty when the U.S. had troops in Syria against the Syrian government's will? Did you care about sovereignty then? Should Russia have invaded to protect the sovereignty of Syria?
Well, I mean, we can go if you want to go into the academic area of sovereignty theory and the right to intervene in civil wars, we can do that if you want to, because there's a body of fucking work that argues that yes, there are legitimate reasons to intervene in sovereignty, because the sovereignty of a civil war, when you've got like competing forces that are prepared to go to war, that you're not instigating, importantly, from kind of the more liberal side of sovereignty theory, yes, you intervene. And at the same time, it's not a simple case with something like Syria, because it wasn't just the West intervening, was it? It was also Russia intervening. So, and you know what, you can say that we could have hands off, that proxy wars are bad for business, or damage democracy, or the development of states. I might even fucking agree with you. But unless you're going to get Russia to come round to this fucking Twitch poll panel and agree to the same shit, we might have to do something. Otherwise, Syria is going to remain a despotic hellhole. We're going to end up like in those situations where our people who really do disagree with our way of life are going to be able to spread that influence further and further and normalize it. And again, I think there's a moral question there.
Also, wait,
Okay,
what are these U.S. attacks on Syria? Wait, did I miss something?
Trump bombed Syria. Biden bombed Syria like a month into his presidency. The reason Biden bombed Syria was he claimed that at the same time he was involved in the Iran deal. If my friend Progressive Brad's listening, I did say Iran. We were involved in the Iran deal. He was trying to get us back into that, to give them money and stuff. At that exact same time, he bombed Syria because he claimed that the Iranian government had agents in Syria that attacked U.S. interests. So we violated the sovereignty of Syria by bombing their territory in order to kill people from a different third country.
Sure. Okay. So just so we're
Okay.
clear,
If you want me to translate that, what happened is there was militias in Iraq which bombed our bases, then crossed into Syria, then we bombed them there.
Yeah. So to be clear,
We
also,
bombed Syria.
just to reiterate, the only attacks that were done in Syria were post Obama's administration. I believe it was only under Trump that happened, right?
I'm not certain, but let me say, if that's a criticism of me because I voted for Trump, you will find that one of the most egregious things that I thought Trump did was bomb Syria. And in fact, in a previous debate I had with Dylan said the single worst thing that Trump did was trying to pull out of Syria, when I heavily criticized Trump for a troop presence and bombing Syria. I think it was despicable.
Okay.
But Biden continued that trend as soon as he was in office. I don't think that the United States would accept if
What the fuck just happened?
terrorists in Mexico fled to the United States and China said, F it, that we're going to bomb Texas because these terrorists are here. I don't think the United States would say, well, fair enough. They weren't bombing us. They were bombing militants from another country that fled and crossed the border. That's horseshit.
I
And the
could
point
be
trying to
wrong, but I don't think that would happen, because I think we would probably nuke off the face of the earth if there were terrorists that did like a terror attack on Mexico and they tried to flee into the United States, I'm pretty sure we would obliterate them. I don't think, I could be wrong, but, or like for Canada, I don't think we would ever provide safe harbor to terrorists that were attacking targets in Canada. So that issue would never happen.
What if we didn't know, right? What if people attacked a Chinese military installation or lab or something in Mexico?
Is the issue that Syria like had no idea, or was it that Syria didn't have the capacity to act?
My understanding was, and Dylan, maybe you know more about this specific situation, but my understanding was there was never commentary released about the fact that the United States contacted Assad and was like, look, we want these people dealt with, and Assad said no. My understanding was this was something that occurred very fast, that this attack occurred on U.S. military installations, and then the bombing happened like within a few days. Am I wrong,
No,
Bill?
we did not ask Assad, no.
Right. So we, against his sovereignty, we attacked. And again, this is the whole boondoggle that we see. Basically, what Beckett said is he gives ad hoc justification for, well, it's okay when the United States or the globalists violate sovereignty. I could give you nation after nation.
Wait, okay. Let me ask you a question. Okay, so the problem with hardcore Islamism, when we're talking about the most like radical, like extremist, like ISIS type ideology, right? It's not a ideology. It's like, oh, we're gonna stay in Syria. Oh, we're gonna stay in Iraq. It's transnational. That's why the whole thing, Counterpoints put this into topic, was because terrorism and the transnational version of terrorism is a modern issue for globalism. Even if you were to try to become the most isolationist nationalist state in the world, the transnational version of terrorism we see today is still going to try to expand because it's in their ideological interest to expand. Their belief structure is that their belief structure is going to conquer the entire world, take it over, make that on Earth before the end times eventually come one day. And so when that's the type of ideology you're dealing with, it is in the interest of all nation states, all of them, the whole world, to deal with that. Assad was not fighting ISIS. He was fighting his own people. He was too busy gassing them, bombing them, killing them across his country in order to deal with ISIS. So there was an international coalition made up of Kurds, the Iranian government, the United States, the militias that Iran was backing, all these other things to fight against ISIS. And that is why we have a mission in Syria, is because the Assad government couldn't do their fucking job. And so you can say that that's a violation of their sovereignty. Yeah, but ISIS was also constantly violating the sovereignty of many nations, whether it was in the Pulse nightclub shooting or many other attacks that they organize across the world. And so, since ISIS wasn't able to deal with that threat, as multiple nations around the world was being attacked and they were selling oil across the world to finance more terror attacks, the world stepped up, they dealt with it, and you can say that's a problem with sovereignty, but ISIS was violating everyone's sovereignty and Assad couldn't deal with it.
So this is a clever sleight of hand, right? What you've seen, I've had this discussion many times with Phil. What happened was we were under the auspices of fighting ISIS. But if we go into a country to fight ISIS, even if we don't think the country that is dealing with it, that you're invading, is doing a good job with it, you would still cooperate with that country, even if you thought they were doing other bad shit. I don't think it's unprecedented for the United States to deal with countries that are doing bad shit. See Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, that the United States continues to support.
Wait, Assad, during the start of the revolution, he released terrorists from prison at the very start of it to make the revolutionaries look like terrorists. He exacerbated the problem, abandoned northeastern Syria. We communicate with the Assad regime. We've set up checkpoints across. There's like little tours and stuff that are done and all this other stuff. And there's conversations about negotiations that aren't happening, but their government exacerbated the issue every step of the way. And so, I mean, we can talk to the Assad regime. I think they've won when it comes to the struggle during the civil war. I think that's clear. They're most likely to have won unless something radically change it. We should communicate with them, but it's not like they were really helping in those early days.
It
Can I
doesn't
just have a
matter
point
if
of
they were helping or
clarification
not.
really quickly as well?
Please.
Just quickly, because I think it matters, because I don't know if because again, I've read a lot of sovereignty theory. I was lectured by people who are like leaders in the field in sovereignty theory, and I fucking hate sovereignty theory. So like, I don't know whether my position matches Dylan's. So if you want to argue about sovereignty theory, like I feel like you're mixing our arguments a little bit.
I can leave it to you, Juan, if you want to go back and forth.
No. I'm like, again, I'm more than happy for you to continue. I just don't want Rob to apply my arguments to you. Does that make sense? I don't think
the
that's
idea of sovereignty theory, I understand. What I'm saying with you with sovereignty theory is it seemed that your justification was the United States should get involved in Ukraine, not because Russia could do shit to fuck up other countries or like European allies or NATO allies, but because we need to protect sovereignty. And then you're like, well, my sovereignty theory, the unique interpretation I have is sometimes it's okay to violate country's sovereignty if it's for the greater good. So
is that really that crazy?
What's that?
Is that really that crazy? Like, we make rules for this stuff like this all the time.
You can't say we are justified in militaristic engagements because the idea of protecting sovereignty is so important. But when we violate other nations' sovereignty, or when globalists violate other nations, every single time we are right to do it. We're right. We were good to do it.
Number one, I don't endorse all of America's use of military force in the globe. I don't endorse the invasion of Iraq. I don't think we should be supporting the Saudis in Yemen. There's a million things I could like stand up and say these are bad invasions. These are things I condemn.
Should Russia invade?
Let me no, I don't think Russia
sovereignty?
I don't think Russia could invade I don't think they would have solved anything. But under international law, it would have been legal to send weapons to Saddam Hussein, just like it's legal for us to send weapons to Ukraine. But when it comes to this issue, in the Bible, it says, thou shalt not kill. But if someone comes up to me, puts a gun to my head, I'm going to kill you, and I come out, take a knife, stab him in the neck, no one's going to say, that shouldn't be allowed. So, Dylan, you say in some instances you shouldn't kill, but in this instance you killed. There are certain scenarios where certain things can be violated because, hey, the rules have changed because you have violated something that the world community has said is the norm. For example, when it comes to laws, it is illegal to detain somebody, usually. It is illegal to grab them, to kidnap them, and do that. But if a cop arrests you for smoking crack on a street corner before assaulting a homeless person, yeah, you're gonna get arrested. And now something that used to be, hey, this isn't allowed, you can't do this, is now allowed because the conditions have changed. Because of the transnational nature of ISIS and the Assad regime's inability to deal with it, there had to be an international operation to deal with the problem. Because it wasn't just spilling over into Syria, it wasn't just spilling over into Iraq, it was spilling over into Libya, it was spilling over into Philippines, it was spilling over into terror attacks in Paris, in the United States, all across the world. And their hub was in Assad's country, which he let become a fucking mess due to his inability to rule it.
Okay, as I was saying before, Beckett chimed in, which was fair, like no problem. But to keep my train of thought here, I've had this discussion with Dylan before, and you notice this clever sleight of hand that he shows here. So he's like, we had to be there to fight ISIS. It was pretty good, Dylan. We had to be there to fight ISIS. That's why you're there. What he ignores is when pushed on this, he'll admit that we were also pressuring and doing things against Assad. We also were doing that. And so what he's saying here is, well, we had to go in because ISIS is so bad and Assad couldn't deal with them. So we had to violate Syria's sovereignty and say, you can't take care of this problem. We think it's going to affect us. So we're going to go in. We're going to take care of it. But while we're here, we're going to fuck with you too. That's not the interpretation of, well, we had to come into someone's house and clean it up. That's, we came into their house, cleaned it up, and then started punching them in the face. That's what happened. That's the violation of sovereignty, specifically in Syria I'm talking about. And you can say what you want, but you heard Dylan say, he said it was when I commented on his opening statement. Go back and listen to his initial opening statement when he came in. He said the expansion of globalism in Europe and the expansion of NATO could be one of the reasons that Russia invaded. Do you agree with that statement that you made previously? That the expansion of NATO could have been a reason?
Absolutely, it could be a reason. It's a shit reason to invade a country, but it could be. Just like, for example, gay people getting the right to marry could be a reason why gay hate crimes spike. That doesn't mean there's a good reason gay hate crimes are spiking. I believe the European project is moral. I believe the European project is right. And if European states want to democratically join a project for international trade, democracy promotion, and encouraging peace, because the European Union has been one of the best peacemakers in Europe ever, then I think that's perfectly fine. And the majority, and by the way, I do want to go back, pivoting away from Syria because we've kind of gotten off topic, back to a comment you said earlier about the NGOs starting the coup in Ukraine, starting the.
I didn't say that.
What did you say? What was your statement?
I said the NGOs could have been involved in the way, even if it wasn't a revolution. There clearly was NGOs financed by the United States that were involved in trying to encourage an outcome that was more friendly to the United States and harmful to Russia.
They're on the home front.
That's true. You can't deny that.
So the problem with the Euromaidan, and I don't like with this framing around the 2014, is what happened in Euromaidan is this, and this is I think the narrative most people don't know, is that it didn't actually start with just protesters coming on the street. How it started was Russia was engaging in economic coercion after Yanukovych was fulfilling on a promise he made to enter in a trade deal with the European Union that included visa-free travel and a bunch of other stuff. That economic coercion included stopping 25% of your nation's trade right at the border, just stopping it there, something they promised not to do in the Budapest Memorandum. So Yanukovych, at the last minute, after getting a call from Mr. Vladdy D himself, says, you know what, instead of doing this deal with the European Union, I'm going to do the deal with Russia's economic stuff. This causes protesters to go out on the street. Now, this was spontaneous. This couldn't have been organized by an NGO. This couldn't have been NGO encouraged. This is in the middle of the night, like 1 a.m., 2 a.m., they go out on the street. Then they're responded to with violence by the Berkut and literal hired gangsters known as the Tutushki, which went out and beat them and murdered them. Then protests erupt because protesters getting murdered, protesters getting beaten with metal poles, protesters are getting exploded with flashbangs with nails and screws and bolts tied to it, and that's when the protest exploded. Now, if you look at that from the outside, what do you think are the motivating factors for those people out on the street? Do you think it is hired gangsters by the state? This would be like if Biden hired MS-13 to go to a Trump rally and start fucking firing off at people. Do you think it was that, or do you think it was, oh, an American NGO told me to go out and protest? When we talk about the amount of influence the United States have in Ukraine, a lot of people, I think, really overestimate. And I think the most clear example of this is the Victoria Nuland phone call people talk about all the time. What people don't know is if they listen to the entirety of that Victoria Nuland phone call, in that phone call, they say, hey, I think the protesters should accept a deal that Yanukovych offers them. The protesters then afterward do the exact opposite of what American officials were asking that they do, not accept the deal, keep protesting, which led to Yanukovych fleeing the country. If we were really trying to use these NGOs to exert the will of American government, then they failed, because the will of the American government was not fulfilled in there. They went further than what the American government pursued.
Did Americans get the president
guys,
they wanted?
Rob, pause 1 second. I don't want you to ask a question. I want you to give a response. Then I want Nevin to go, because I did see his hand up probably about 3 minutes ago, but we had such a passionate rant that it felt, I saw like the hair waving back and forth. It felt like bad to interrupt it. I want Rob to respond. I want Nevin to go. And bear in mind, we're about like 10 minutes from wrapping up. So if you want to get your last shots in, get your last shots in. Then we're going to do shout outs. If you want to hang out with us for the following hour where we kind of decompress and talk to each other, you're more than welcome to. If you got other stuff to do, like, I don't know, trying to become a grandmaster at StarCraft or whatever the fuck, then you can dip out at the 2 hour mark. But Rob response, Nevin rant, open again, and we're going to start doing outros in about 10 minutes or so.
First off, StarCraft. I thought Destiny was League of Legends now. I thought the StarCraft days were over. But anyways, specifically on this Syria, on this situation, notice we got away from Syria because it turns out, oh yeah, the United States was doing stuff. I want to go to this real quick. Please, let me, like, Dylan, what do you want from me? It's basically
Dylan, let Rob do a response, Nevin go, and then we'll open it back up and you guys can tear each other's throats out for the last 10 minutes. So go ahead.
So on Syria, so we can see that Dylan admits that NATO expansion, which by the way is a militaristic alliance, but he thinks it's unfathomable that a country that is the sole reason for the alliance existing, basically, and the military alliance is expanding closer and closer to the border. It's unfathomable, but that could be something that would be a good reason for them to start to be worried. The attacks on Assad, we can see, which was one of the allies. The fact that regardless of the specific reason, whether the NGOs or Victoria Nuland or whatever, by the way, Dylan's full of shit that these things happen totally spontaneously. Every color revolution that the United States has ever participated in, you could make arguments. Well, that was a shitty regime. Almost every regime, particularly in areas like Eastern Europe, the Middle East, etc., are shitty regimes. But that doesn't mean that name me a country that's not.
No, name me the evidence that it wasn't spontaneous.
Okay, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to interrupt this flow because I already know you guys are going to kick each other. So, Nevin, share
immediately
the thoughts you wanted to share. Everybody represent for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll be out. Go ahead, Nevin.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask more of a question since the passions are flying here. You know, how far, Dylan, would you support Ukraine? How far would you go in military and economic support? Would you just stop at the export of HIMARS and other defensive equipment, even the tanks, which arguably can be also aggressive equipment? I would argue it's defensive. And Rob, how would you, I'm not trying to play host, I'm just genuinely curious. Rob, what would your policy specifically be with Ukraine? It doesn't sound like, obviously you're not a supporter of the Russian side, but would you just let the Russian forces just withdraw support and let them potentially roll into Kiev? I mean,
You want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I'm supportive of the HIMARS. I think the HIMARS have been particularly destructive to Russian logistics. From my conversations with the Ukrainian soldiers when I was over there, they praised that a lot. They seem to be very much like the HIMARS. I would, from what I was told, some of them actually like to take like selfies with it, almost like it's a celebrity because it's been so effective. But I mean, I'm very supportive. I think we need to up ammunition production in countries like South Korea and Japan and the United States, because artillery shells is going to be something Ukraine's going to need if it's going to conduct the spring offensive everybody wants them to. I do think we need to supply them the armor, and I'll even go to the point where I think that we should be training Ukrainian soldiers in F-16s and secret, and planning for the long haul for eventually when Ukraine gets integrated into European security structures.
Okay, and I'll answer about what would I like to see happen in Ukraine. Before I lose my train of thought in this, the most important thing about the color revolution or the NGOs, at the end of the day, regardless if it was organic or not, the United States got the president that they wanted, that was at their beck and call, that literally affected their legal system so much that when there were globalist organizations like those that were sponsored by the Obama State Department, George Soros, the Obama State Department through George Kent was, I mean, it's funny, I get it.
Where did Soros come in?
By the way, weren't we going to do a debate in Burisma that you ran from, Destiny? That you could laugh just like you did about hiding the bodies, right? That you were proving an ass on that too. But nonetheless, what you can see is George Kent specifically was telling these organizations in Ukraine that he was giving money to the NABU, that the Obama State Department, not to prosecute certain organizations, again violating the sovereignty of the people of Ukraine. So the United States got the president they wanted, which was another reason, even if they didn't lead to it, to piss Russia off. What would I like to see happen in Ukraine? I would have liked to have seen a movement that was attempting to use diplomacy to resolve the situation before thousands of Ukrainians and Russians had to die. Does that mean that initially Russia would have beholden to that, or even that they still would have? Probably not. By exacerbating the situation, though, by continuing to spend billions upon billions of dollars. Dylan, you could correct me if I'm wrong on this. $100 billion? And I believe the budget for Russia's military is $80 billion. What this is doing is ensuring that the conflict ensues. So instead, we should have been approaching a diplomatic resolution instead of encouraging one side to keep fighting so that their livelihoods could be ruined because this war would continue and with no end in sight. And mark my words, if it escalates, God forbid that a tactical nuclear weapon or something like that be deployed, people like Dylan Burns and others, who I like Dylan a lot, I really do, but people that were so flippant about, oh, there's no possibilities for peace, oh, we have to keep sending this money, they're not going to take responsibility. Just like they didn't take responsibility with violating Syria and their sovereignty, just like they didn't take responsibility with the expansion of NATO. They have all of these things that they suggest, and when people like me saying we need to stop meddling in affairs around the world like this,
right now.
it causes blowback, and then they say, see, now we need to meddle further.
I officially will take responsibility. If Ukraine is joined into NATO, I take full responsibility. I should get all credit for that. I should get all the rewards for that. I should get everything from that. I should be gifted a ton of cash for that if I achieve that goal. I should be given a medal of honor from the Ukrainian government. Okay, so first off, when you talk about 100 billion compared to 80 billion, that's the total amount of aid. Not military, that's total amount of American aid, period. That's financial, everything. And that includes shipping old equipment. So I don't know if that's really fair to compare to just the military budget, because we need to compare it to everything else that the Russians spent. For example, construction efforts and everything else they've spent on the war in totality. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, if your point right now is that the United States spent money on NGOs, and at the end of the day, America got a leader that they were looked more favorable to. Okay, then I'll say this. The Russians spent a lot of money on the Internet Research Agency. They spent some cash on that. They hired some people to spread a few memes here, spread some disinformation here.
$3,000.
And at the end of the day, you can say, hey, that that I don't know how much of an impact they had, but at the end of the day, they got the guy they wanted. They got Donald Trump. Now, me and you, if we're being honest, we will say, at the end of the day, that probably had a very small impact. We don't know exactly how the impact was, but they did get who they wanted. I view it very similarly to what happened with the NGOs. I think to a lesser extent, because we don't see the United States spreading misinformation in Ukraine in order to benefit their candidates. It's them promoting NGOs that are dealing with issues like corruption or democracy promotion, which is a huge issue in Ukraine. And when we talk about all these prosecutors that got fired, like Viktor Shokin was a corrupt piece of shit bastard who didn't deserve his job. The European Union said so. Most Ukrainian civil activists said so. The World Trade Organization said so. The United States said so. This was a bipartisan issue between Republican and Democrats. Hell, if Donald Trump was president at the time, he would have said so. And you want to know what? It was a really Trumpian move what Biden did, going over there saying, hey buddy, if you don't do this, I'm going to actually hold all this aid back, and if you don't get rid of this guy who isn't prosecuting all these corrupt bastards, I thought you would praise a guy over something like that. But since it wasn't Donald Trump and he had a blue hat on his head instead of a red hat, you're not praising him.
No, that's because you're lying. Just like what you did is give a great example of why these globalist institutions shouldn't be institutions that we trust our sovereignty to, because they are self-interested and corrupt. Yeah, all of these organizations said that about Viktor Shokin, for example. Now, it's interesting.
All of them are wrong. All of them were serving Hunter Biden, every single one, and Soros, of course. You got to mention him.
If you'd let me finish my point, then maybe you'd be enlightened for once. You know, I know the CIA is paying you to be here, but calm down. Let me get through my point. So,
not much.
not enough.
Wait, I want to hear this. Are you really going to
Finally,
defend Shokin? Yeah, what's the defense for Shokin?
Yeah, I'll defend Shogun. By the way, Destiny, you said you would debate me on this. I'd be happy to do
Yeah, I
a
just
full
haven't
debate.
gone around to it, but I'm curious what the defense of Shokin
Let's
was.
defend Shokin. So one of the arguments about Victor Shokin was the fact that he was not prosecuting Burisma, correct?
No.
Zachowski,
Burisma, no, actually, not only was it not about Burisma, I don't think Burisma by name was ever even mentioned. This is a minor company in Ukraine insofar as all of the corruption that existed there. The problem with Shokin was that there was so much corruption around the energy industry in Ukraine, and he wasn't moving on any of it. That was the issue. Burisma was a small player compared to everything that wasn't being dealt with in that country.
Wait. So you just contradicted yourself. You said there was corruption surrounding the energy industry in Ukraine, and he wasn't prosecuting any of it. But Burisma, well, if he was prosecuting Burisma, then he was prosecuting at least some of it, correct?
Burisma was a small player. They weren't even there.
percentage?
But I don't know what percentage, but I do remember reading that the name of Burisma wasn't even brought up when people complained about Shokin's inability to act on the corruption that existed in that country.
So let's go through the list, right? So then Shokin, what we were told repeatedly, that the reason it was okay. I want to go real quick to something real quick. Dylan talked about coercion being the reason that the revolution started, right? But it's okay, a country that's desperate for U.S. funds, to say we're not going to give you the funds unless you fire a prosecutor. By the way, who happens to be looking at the company that my son is on the board of directors. By the way, that exact no other prosecutors, just that one, right? Now, Dylan's full of shit because he knows if it was Donald Trump forcing the firing of a prosecutor that happened to be looking into one of his son's companies, there's no fucking way that Dylan or the Democrats would say, oh, that's fair. That guy was corrupt for other reasons, so no problem. I know this because they supported the Mueller investigation that started because Trump wanted the firing of James Comey, even though Republicans and Democrats both believed that James Comey should be fired. Because they said, well, it doesn't matter if other people believed it. The fact that the president could have had a personal stake in firing this guy.
Hold on, what are we talking about right now?
Well, let me
A
finish.
completely
Wait,
separate
no,
topic, like every
to be
time
clear,
Rob
hold on.
talks.
My understanding is Burisma was a very small, like, privately owned company. Like, it didn't have, like, when we're talking about the energy industry in Ukraine, there was, like, one company that owned, like, fucking 80% of it.
So?
That's what the issue had to deal with, was the competitive environment, or the lack of competitive environment that is. But hold on, but the issue was with that company. Burisma was like a small, no-name, privately owned company that nobody gave a fuck about. Naftogaz controlled like 2/3 of the fucking, or more of the natural gas in Ukraine. That's what a lot of the issue was surrounding. The idea that Burisma was like the center point.
That's not true, as even evidenced by the testimony of people at the State Department in the original impeachment of Trump that said that even they were concerned that the Biden administration, or the Obama State Department, had labeled Zlochevsky as a Russian oligarch that was corrupt. And they were very concerned that Hunter Biden went and worked with them, particularly because Joe Biden was the point man to deal with that corruption. So the idea that this was not on anyone's radar is bullshit, according to the very State Department people that are defending Biden. They knew that it was a big deal. They knew that it looked really bad. Now, if you let me finish real quick, I'll get to the end of this. What happened was that we saw that Biden, that there was an investigation. Victor Shokin froze the assets of Zlochevsky. Immediately surrounding that, you saw that the lawyers for Victor Shokin contacted the Obama State Department and said, oh, Hunter Biden's at this company. We would love to talk to someone at the State Department. Then they got an audience with the State Department, and a few weeks later, Joe Biden got in a plane and issued the quid pro quo. The end of the story is, if it's really true that it was just about ending corruption, well, guess once Shokin was fired, guess where all those investigations went? To the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, the NABU.
What was the motivation for firing?
Let me finish real quick. That was
Everything you're saying is wrong.
Administration.
Was
financing great.
There was no, the pressure, I'm pretty sure that finally got Shokin was fired, was the IMF saying they were going to cut off money to Ukraine if they didn't deal with the corruption of the country. Biden just didn't. I don't even think Biden had the power to withhold that aid. I don't think Biden was.
That's not what he testified to.
I don't.
Or what he said.
Biden testified that he was the sole.
I didn't mean testified. Wrong word. He publicly said at the Council of Foreign Relations, he said, I went there and I said, you're not going to get this $1 billion unless you fire him. And they said, you can't do that. And you're not the president. And I said, call him. And wouldn't you know, son of a bitch, before I left, they fired him. Is it just purely coincidental that they fired him?
You're taking the. Do you also believe Biden when he said he had like 170 IQ when he was like a fucking Harvard grad, when he was shouting at that one person in front of? Do we believe yeah, I'm sure he's gonna puff his chest up to try to make him sound as good as possible. But I'm pretty sure it was the IMF threatening to withhold funds that finally got Shokin fired. But like, here's something that I'm pretty sure of. If Biden hadn't intervened whatsoever, Shokin still would have been out. Like, the guy was taking bribes from tons of people.
Well,
there was a lot of corruption in Ukraine that wasn't being looked into. Like,
That's not what he's testified to under oath. He testified under oath that Poroshenko specifically told him that he was being removed because Joe Biden wanted him removed and they needed that $1 billion in
Hold on,
aid.
who
That's what he
testified
was
under
told.
oath when? That he was removed solely because of Biden? Who said that?
That's what Shokin said. That's what Poroshenko said. There's also phone calls
Wait,
that show...
under oath where? In an American court? Or what are we talking about right now? Oh, I'm sorry, when you
I
say...
believe it was a Ukrainian deposition.
And
Okay.
So, anyways, to finish my point,
Let's
it's
let you guys
just
wrap
real
this
quick,
up,
Connor.
and then we're gonna do outros. So wrap it up, please.
I'll as brief as I can, which is not very brief. But it went to the NABU that was created by Obama. So if it's true that, okay, well, these dudes were corrupt, that Shokin was corrupt, they weren't prosecuting, why is it that the NABU almost instantaneously dropped the investigation into Burisma and Zlochevsky? Someone who the Obama State Department people said was a Russian oligarch who was corrupt in the energy industry.
Wait, but the whole point was that they weren't investigating Burisma, though. That was part of the problem.
They froze their assets. Now you've changed your stance. You said that wasn't the point. It had nothing to do about not investigating Burisma. They
It was-
literally froze their
Holy shit.
assets, and then immediately the people from Zlochevsky were at the Obama State Department,
Oh,
which
he was getting redder.
immediately
You
led
can see
to
him.
Biden going and
He's
saying,
tomato
"We want
frying.
this guy fired." You don't think freezing the assets of the owner of Burisma, the corrupt Russian oligarch, you don't think that that's no evidence that an investigation?
Okay, hold on.
was occurred?
You just say like 50 things that are all not true. I'm just curious. If you can give one source, if there's a chat room here in the Discord, if you can throw one thing where anybody that is anything like important said that the reason why we fired this guy was because of Biden, or the reason why we fired this guy was because Burisma was threatened, I would love to see that. I've never seen anything like that substantiated in my entire life.
Okay, so what we're gonna do here, because we're running out of time, and I want to be respectful to everybody's time. You are welcome, because this is the most animated I've seen Destiny all night.
Okay.
You are welcome to stay here and continue on the debate of Ukraine, Biden corruption, all that kind of stuff, and then just for my edification, if you'll allow me, because I've been listening to you guys for the past 2 hours. What I was hoping for this conversation, which has nothing to do with y'all, you're a panelist, you came here, you gave me content, thank you for your service. 07's in chat to the fucking everybody who's
What
here.
does 07 mean? Could someone tell me?
Salute. It's
like
the
this?
0 is somebody's head, and then the 7 is a salute. So
Sounds like
there
white
you go.
supremacy to me. But...
True, except for the Roman one would be like an eye, so it would just be like, one arm going out. I won't do that for Twitch purposes. Anyways, the point is, we're going to do outros. We're going to let everybody say whatever they want to say for 1 to 2 minutes about either the topics or about, basically this new topic. Then at that point, people are free to leave. If they want to stay here and if they want to hang out and they want to continue the Burisma conversation, that's fine. If they want to stay here and bullshit, get drunk, smoke pot, do whatever, and hang out with their fellow debaters and bring down the temperature, they're welcome to. If they just want to say, fuck you, I need to do something else, they can dip out. So what we're going to do is, since Rob and Destiny and Dylan are the last folks who were kind of talking about this subject, I'm going to let them go last. I'm going to let Beckett go first, then Nevin, and then we'll get into the other contenders. Beckett, can you please share any final thoughts that you have in reference to globalism, nationalism, corruption in Ukraine, anything you want to talk about, and also shout yourself out. Where can people find you on Twitch, YouTube, or Twitter, or anywhere else you want to highlight?
Cool. Well, other than my home address, obviously. Beckett of Crabs. You can find me on Twitter, Twitch. I have a YouTube channel that I never do anything with, and I do Odyssey streams. I do, as I say, old school internet law and obscure history and stuff from the alt-right. I do some counterterrorism stuff, theology, and just shoot the shit generally. There's a quote I really like because I kind of like I wanted to let this run because fuck, it's really impressive to see like Dylan go through some of this stuff. I'll be honest, but like I really like the quote. War is the continuation of politics by other means. They're like this idea that we can just cut ourselves off and live as islands. It's just not true. There's a really famous anthropology find, which was basically a tribal community that had been separated by a river. And in the section that had been separated off, they found that the people who were separated off from the mainland not only hadn't progressed in their tool uses, had regressed to be not able to understand how to use the tools of their ancestors. We're not just tribal, we are a highly social species. We collect generally as we grow. And whether we're talking about the fall of Mesopotamia, the fall of Rome, the fall of the Chinese Empire, the fall of the Middle Eastern Empire, the truth is we always grow back to globalism. And that's not just because we don't learn from history, it's because we recognize the intrinsic value of sharing culture, sharing trade, sharing values, and growing stronger, because that's generally how humans work. And it's one of the reasons that we call the Dark Ages the Dark Ages, is because that's what went away. It wasn't just the progress, because we still had that. It was that we lost kind of the wider worldview. Thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. I'll stick around as well because it's a laugh. And yeah, cool.
Thank you for coming out, even though you were high on pain pills. It is appreciated.
My tooth is fucking killing me, but that's fine.
Still based. It helps you to be eloquent, so I appreciate it. Mr. Nevin, can you share with us any final thoughts you have, and also where people?
My headphones are dying.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion
Or like kill
on
me.
the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I think we should continue to provide the HIMARS and other defensive equipment with that. At the same token, I also am wary about poking the Russian bear too much. But we can't just simply pull the plug on Ukraine either. So I'm steering kind of a middle course on that, just to exercise caution. I'm a radical civic nationalist. It's a term of my coinage. I guess you could say it. What Arthur Schlesinger Jr., President Kennedy's former assistant, would say the vital center, what has been termed the radical center. It emphasizes a sense of community without suffocating individualism, and a type of individualism that is not overly atomistic. Wherefore, radical civic nationalism is for continuous national improvement of the people, the health, the wealth of the people, maintaining a reasonable level of sovereignty. When it comes to allies, I don't believe in most cases there's such a thing as allies. Countries have intersections of interest. Yes, countries are going to band together to defeat radical Islamic terrorism, but also when you look at the historical data, some of these same countries that we're allied to, like in their dealings with Iran, NATO countries, Germany, and others, they have traded high technology with the Iranians. So we have to recognize that there are limits to alliances. We have to approach dealing with other countries, friends and neutrals, with both eyes open, rather than being blinded by any ideology, any ideological extreme. You can find me, I mean, I can go on and on and on about this, but you can find me on the Populist Patriot YouTube channel. I do live streams on occasion. I interview guests from across the spectrum. I have books that you can access on Amazon.com. If you want free PDFs, I'd be happy to email it to you. Thank you all for having me. It's been an interesting discussion, and I've learned quite a bit too as well.
Awesome. Thank you kindly. And then, Mr. Dillon, can you tell folks where to find you, the interesting things you're doing, also any final thoughts? And then if you do want to lead into what you and Rob and Destiny have going on, go ahead. If you need to dip out, go ahead as well. When you're
session, I'm like suck my cock and balls.
So my name is Dylan Burns. I'm an amateur, very amateur war journalist and Twitch streamer. You can find me at Dylan Burns TV, DYLANBORNS TV on Twitch. Same thing on YouTube, and on my second channel on YouTube, Dylan Burns Live, is where I repost my live content. Interesting stuff I'm doing. On March 4th, I'm flying back to Europe, and around the 15th, I'm going to be crossing the border back into Ukraine to film with the crews who disarm IEDs. The munitions left back by the Russian army, which are still killing a lot of civilians, are going to be in the country for a very long time. Even after the war is over, as we've seen in other countries like Cambodia, it can be a real humanitarian crisis for those left behind. So I want to talk to people who are going to be doing God's work for the next few years. I want to show the type of work they have to go through. I'm going to interview soldiers and a bunch of other stuff. So if you want to support me in that mission, just viewing my content, donating something, anything like that, I greatly appreciate. As for this, I think it was William Tecumseh Sherman who said that the only just cause for is a more prosperous peace. The only just cause for war is a more prosperous peace. And when we see what Ukraine is facing right now, that is what that is the options on the table. What the Russians are currently putting forward for negotiations is that they get to annex Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. Ukraine has to accept neutrality, meaning they can't join any defensive alliances that could stop an invasion from happening in the future, and they have to demilitarize large swaths of their territory, making it easier for the Russians to invade next time when they'll be more prepared, they'll lick their wounds, they'll be ready in advance, and the Ukrainians will have less ability to defend themselves from international institutions, alliances, and from their demilitarization. That is an unacceptable standard that the Russians are putting forward, and it shows that the Russian position and the Ukrainian position are irreconcilable right now. And for all the talk of negotiated settlements at the moment, it just isn't in the cards. And so the Ukrainians are pushing for a more prosperous peace. Zelensky actually talked about recently how he doesn't see the struggle as just a struggle to end this war, but to end the cycle of oppression and colonialism that the Russian state has engaged in Ukraine for generations. And that's going to need a Ukrainian victory, a strong Ukrainian victory. And that is not dependent on solely the will of the Ukrainian people, which has been strong throughout the entirety of this war, but also on Western support. And so I hope those at home will give them that support as they go forward in this struggle. You can find me at Dylan Burns TV.
Thank you kindly, sir. While you're working with VOD teams, my friendly advice, which I'm gonna give you more in DMs, whether you want it or not.
wish I
keep
could
your fucking armor
escape.
and the helmet on. Don't be by the truck while they're loading up the explosives. And if they give you an option
just
to
'cause they
stay
stole
by the
back
robot
this
control
random piece
or
of
to walk
territory.
up with the Texas cowboy who's walking up to disarm shit with his fucking hands, stay with the robot tech so you don't come home a fucking chicken nugget without any arms or legs. But I love you, I appreciate you, and I'll DM you some shit. Destiny, can you share any final thoughts you have? Anything interesting you want to pick Rob at? Where people can find you?
Hi, I'm Destiny. You can find me at youtube.com/Destiny and Instagram.com/Destiny.
Okay, based. And then Rob, final thoughts and shout outs, and then whoever, when Rob is done, whoever wants to leave, leave, and whoever wants to stay, stay.
Okay, yeah, my name's Rob Noor. You can find me at Normal America with Rob Noor on YouTube, Normal America on Rumble as well on Twitch. It's just Rob Noor, ROPNOERR. Also, I do a panel show on Saturdays. I know Connor's going to be part of it. Dylan's going to be part
Be there tomorrow.
So you guys can take it out on me, and I just have to sit there. But no, I'm looking forward to it. If any of you, other three gentlemen, would like to be on that show, ever, just reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to have you on. This topic specifically of globalism. Look, globalism, as we didn't talk about it in general as much as I would have liked. We got more specific on a couple of issues, but I think globalism decentralizes government from individuals. Government is better at the local level. It's better at levels that are closer to it. I don't think that the idea of globalism is necessary part and parcel with the idea of getting against isolationism. For example, I don't believe that we shouldn't trade with any nations. I don't believe that we shouldn't have cultural economic exchanges with other nations. What I believe is that our government exists for the interest of the citizens of this country, and I expect other countries to do the same. It's in that vein that I do feel terrible for the people of Ukraine, because it seems like they are a puppet state of the United States or Russia, and have been so for a very, very long time. Zelensky, let me be quite clear here. Dylan, I hope that you're safe and the friends you made there in Ukraine are safe. I really, from the bottom of my heart, mean that, even if I disagree. I hope that Russia loses tomorrow. I hope that it's over. I hope that they leave with their tail. I really do hope that. But what we can't ignore is the terrible
colonization,
nature
diplomatic
that
action,
NATO
access to
expansion,
diplomatic
that
lens,
the provocations that have been done by these globalist regime in going against Russia and going against other people that they target, just like they did in Libya, just like they did in Iraq, just like they did in Afghanistan. And what I'm concerned with, Dylan, is 5 years from now we'll be having a conversation about how these very neocon, neo-lib people that you've cheered on right now are going to throw the people of Ukraine under the bus, and their country is going to be far worse off than if we would have just stopped meddling in the first place and encouraging this seemingly never-ending war that's resulting in all sorts of economic boons for the people that these sort of establishment Republicans and Democrats like military-industrial complex and other sorts. So I think it's terrible. I think that Zelensky's a horrible, horrible man. Don't forget, he tried to lie when Ukraine accidentally had a missile hit Poland and say that it was Russia. He suggested that perhaps we should use nuclear weapons in Russia before Russia does them with us. This is a lunatic. He's getting personally enriched. He is leading to this war escalating, and I hope that it doesn't come to the worst outcome. I still think there's a low chance of that, but it could happen. We need to be sober-minded about this stuff, and that's the reason that I think we should go against globalism, because the fucking maniacs that run the globalist system don't give a shit about anyone on this panel. They don't give a shit about normal people. They give a shit about consolidating power. Just like you might say the nationalist governments do as well, but at least it's closer to the people. And the more we expand it, the less that will be cared for. I'd be happy to continue to make Destiny and Dylan look foolish, particularly on the Ukraine, Boris Zolchevsky stuff. But they'll run from the debate. They always do. Is that right, Destiny? You said you'd do it last time, and you ran.
I'll stay here and talk about it if you want.
Rob, do you speak Ukrainian?
What's that?
Do you speak Ukrainian?
No, I don't believe that's the language.
Okay, so no. It's just that the video that you're talking about, where Zelensky and is talking about doing the preemptive nuclear strike,
Mhm.
he didn't say that. He was talking about preemptively arming the Ukrainian nation. The words were edited afterwards to make it seem like that. I can send you an AP article where it specifically does
I
this.
will
If you,
happily-
unless you
Alright.
speak the language and you.
Gentlemen,
don't know.
before we do it, I just want to give anybody who wants to leave the opportunity to leave. If you guys want to stay, stay. Free fucking content for me. Content, baby. So I'm gonna go get some water. You guys are free to conduct yourselves however the fuck you want. You were always allowed to say retarded. You were always allowed to say bitch. You were always allowed to say bastard and cunt and all that kind of stuff. That never happened on this stream. I appreciate your guys' professionalism.
Okay,
but if
what
you
about
wanna...
the real slurs? Can we get racial in here, or what? Are you just gonna be a pussy?
See, actually,
Yeah, that's
here's
what
the
I
thing.
thought. There it is. Yeah.
Listen.
That's what I thought.
You know,
That's what I
and, well,
thought.
The
listen, I
globalists
wanna
win
say
again.
I want to say the N-word with an A, not with an ER, but I haven't followed through on my Patreon promise yet, which is basically like we'll set up like a $50 tier where basically we'll just direct all of it to disadvantaged communities in order for people to earn their slur pass. So maybe once we set up the Patreon for slur passes, then we'll start getting into the
Gotcha.
N-word and the
Okay.
K slur and all that kind of stuff.
Say that for the Prime Kai panels, okay?
It's for a good cause, right?
I'm just saying that's the way, like it would. Anyways,
That's fine,
neither
but wait,
here
here,
nor
just real quick to tie this YouTube video up for August. So earlier in this conversation, I didn't actually know this existed. Earlier in the conversation, you and Rob had posed to me the question, if there was actually an investigation, would you be okay with that? And I said, well, even if there was, you guys would probably reject the findings anyways. That just happened right here. I just want that to be demonstrated. You actually don't care about the results of any investigation. We just saw that, but go ahead.
I bring
You
the
lie
receipts.
probably more than anybody I've ever spoken to before. That's why for you, I
Give me
have to
one.
get...
What's the lie? Go ahead, give me one.
Okay, I have to defend Rob's honor here, okay?
Uh-huh.
He doesn't lie. He believes what he says.
Literally, the
I'm right,
entire
like
section that we
95%
just
of the
did
time.
earlier on Brexit was hilarious. You didn't even know that the country had Brexited yet, but you were out here like pounding your chest about
Look,
how like confident you
I
were about
will-
everything related to Brexit.
Listen,
It's
listen.
insane. Like Jesus.
Listen.
Uh-huh.
I'll say this. I was out of my depth in the Brexit.
Okay.
Okay. Well, that was interesting, I guess. Goddamn. Not another recession. Okay. Anyways, I am Finito Bussolini. But thanks. Watch, like, subscribe.